Picture yourself standing before the ruins of a place that should not exist. A city swallowed by sand. A library burned to ash. A kingdom that vanished overnight, leaving only whispers and warnings in ancient texts. Now imagine that someone, somewhere, decided you should never know these places existed. That the memory of them was too dangerous, too powerful, too revealing to be allowed to survive. This is not fantasy. This is history. Our history. The history they tried to erase. For thousands of years, civilizations have risen and fallen. Empires have conquered and collapsed. But some places, some locations, were not simply forgotten by time. They were deliberately removed from memory. Their names struck from records. Their coordinates hidden. Their very existence denied. Why? What could be so dangerous about a place that its memory must be destroyed? What knowledge did these locations contain that threatened those in power? And most importantly, what can we still discover about them, despite centuries of systematic erasure? Tonight, we journey to 15 forbidden places that civilization tried to erase from memory. Some you may know by legend. Others have been hidden so well that their names sound foreign even to scholars. But all share one thing in common. Someone desperately wanted them forgotten. We will examine the archaeological evidence, the historical records that survived, the geological surveys, the expedition journals, the satellite imagery, the testimonies of those who claim to have been there. And we will piece together what remains of these lost places. Some were destroyed by conquest, others by natural disaster. Some simply vanished, as if the earth itself swallowed them whole. And a few, perhaps, were never destroyed at all. Perhaps they are still there, hidden, waiting to be rediscovered by those brave or foolish enough to look. I am Mr. Ravenhurst, and this is the complete investigation into the forbidden places civilization erased from memory. Close your atlas. Everything you think you know about the map of history is incomplete. Let us fill in what has been deliberately left blank. Chapter 1. The Library of Alexandria. We begin with the most famous loss in human history, a place so legendary that its destruction has become synonymous with the death of knowledge itself. But what was the Library of Alexandria, really? What did it contain? And more importantly, was it truly destroyed? Or was it systematically dismantled to hide something? The library was founded in the 3rd century before the Common Era, in Alexandria, Egypt, by Ptolemy I, a general of Alexander the Great. It was not simply a building filled with scrolls. It was an institution, a university, a research center, the greatest collection of human knowledge ever assembled in the ancient world. At its height, the library held somewhere between 400,000 and 1 million scrolls. To understand what this means, consider that a single scroll might contain the equivalent of a modern chapter or short book. We are talking about hundreds of thousands of complete works, histories, philosophies, scientific treatises, mathematical proofs, astronomical observations, medical texts, literature, poetry, religious documents from every culture that had contact with the Mediterranean world. The library's collection policy was aggressive, even ruthless. Every ship that docked at Alexandria was searched. If books were found, they were confiscated, copied, and the copies returned to the owners, while the originals stayed in the library. Ptolemy III borrowed the official state copies of the works of Aeschylus, Sophocles, and Euripides from Athens, paying an enormous deposit. He kept the originals and sent back copies, forfeiting the deposit. This was considered acceptable behavior. The scholars who worked there were the finest minds of the ancient world. Euclid developed geometry there. Eratosthenes calculated the circumference of the Earth with remarkable accuracy. Aristarchus proposed that the Earth revolved around the Sun, 18 centuries before Copernicus. Herophilus conducted the first systematic dissections of human bodies and discovered that the brain, not the heart, was the seat of intelligence. The library contained works that are now lost forever. The complete writings of the pre-Socratic philosophers, the original histories of the Phoenicians, written by themselves rather than their enemies. Egyptian texts dating back thousands of years, including mathematical and astronomical knowledge that would not be rediscovered in Europe until the Renaissance or later. Complete genealogies of the ruling families of the ancient world. Maps of territories we can no longer identify. Scientific experiments we cannot replicate because we do not know what they were. So what happened to it? The common story is that it burned, but the truth is far more complex and far more disturbing. The library did not die in a single catastrophic fire. It died slowly, over centuries, through a combination of war, religious conflict, economic decline, and deliberate suppression of knowledge. Each wave of destruction removed another portion of the collection, and with each loss, those in power had the opportunity to decide what survived and what did not. The first major damage occurred in 48 BCE during Julius Caesar's civil war. Caesar set fire to the Egyptian fleet in Alexandria's harbour. The fire spread to warehouses on the docks, which may have contained scrolls intended for the library or copies for export. Ancient sources disagree on whether the library itself burned at this time. What is certain is that a significant portion of the collection was destroyed. The library limped on. Scholars continued to work there. New acquisitions were made. But it never fully recovered its former glory. Over the following centuries, Alexandria experienced repeated violence. In 270 CE, during the reign of Emperor Aurelian, much of the district containing the library was destroyed during a war with Queen Zenobia of Palmyra. Then came the religious conflicts. As Christianity became the dominant religion of the Roman Empire, pagan temples and institutions came under attack. In 391 CE, the Christian emperor Theodosius I ordered the destruction of all pagan temples. The Serapeum, a temple that housed part of the library's collection, was destroyed by a Christian mob led by the patriarch Theophilus. Countless scrolls were burned. The final blow came with the Arab conquest of Egypt in the 7th century. According to some sources, though these are disputed, the Caliph Omar ordered the remaining scrolls burned, saying that if they agreed with the Quran, they were unnecessary, and if they disagreed, they were heretical. Whether this actually happened is debated by historians. What is not debated is that by this time, the library was already gone. The great collection had been scattered, burned, looted, and lost over 6 centuries of violence. But here is what haunts historians. What did the library contain that powerful people did not want preserved? We know that works contradicting Christian doctrine were deliberately destroyed. We know that texts preserving pre-Christian Egyptian religion were targeted. We know that scientific works proposing ideas deemed heretical were burned. What astronomical knowledge was lost? The ancient Greeks had calculated the size of the Earth, proposed heliocentrism, understood the precession of the equinoxes. What else did they know? What mathematical proofs were destroyed? Archimedes had discovered calculus-like methods 2,000 years before Newton. What other mathematical insights vanished? What historical records were suppressed? The library contained the complete histories of cultures we now know only through their enemies. The Carthaginians, the Etruscans, the Sea Peoples. Entire civilizations reduced to footnotes because their own accounts were destroyed while their conquerors' propaganda survived. And what religious texts were deemed too dangerous to preserve? The library held copies of texts from Persia, India, Babylon, and beyond. Cosmologies that contradicted the orthodox views of Christianity and Islam. Creation myths, prophecies, mystical practices, all burned. Today, scholars estimate that 99% of ancient literature is lost. Most of what we know about the ancient world comes from fragments, quotations in other works, and the tiny percentage of texts that survive through multiple copies or sheer luck. The loss of the Library of Alexandria is not simply the loss of a building, it is the loss of our ability to know our own past. It is a wound in human memory that can never be healed. Modern archaeologists continue to search for the library's remains. The exact location of the main building is still disputed. Excavations in Alexandria occasionally uncover scrolls or fragments, preserved by accident in the dry Egyptian climate. Each discovery is a glimpse of what was lost. Each fragment is a reminder that our understanding of history is built on ruins. The Library of Alexandria was not simply destroyed by accident or by barbarians who did not understand its value. It was systematically dismantled over centuries by people who knew exactly what they were destroying and why. Knowledge is power, and those who control what knowledge survives control history itself. This is why the library was erased, not because it was forgotten, but because it was too dangerous to remember. Chapter 2: Atlantis. Now we turn to the most controversial entry on this list, a place so legendary that many dismiss it as pure fiction. But what if Atlantis was real? What if Plato was not inventing a philosophical allegory, but recording a genuine historical account? And what if the reason we cannot find Atlantis is because someone deliberately erased the evidence of its existence? The story of Atlantis comes to us from Plato, the ancient Greek philosopher, writing around 360 BCE. In his dialogues, Timaeus and Critias, he describes a great island civilization that existed 9,000 years before his time. Atlantis was, according to Plato, larger than Libya and Asia combined, located beyond the Pillars of Hercules, which we now call the Strait of Gibraltar. The Atlanteans, Plato tells us, were a powerful and advanced people. Their capital city was built in concentric rings of land and water. The central island contained the palace and temple. The rings were connected by bridges and tunnels. Ships could sail from the outer ocean directly to the city centre through a great canal. The architecture was magnificent, adorned with precious metals. The Atlanteans had conquered much of the Mediterranean world, but they became corrupt, greedy, overreaching, and so the gods punished them. In a single day and night of catastrophic earthquakes and floods, Atlantis sank beneath the waves. The entire civilization vanished, and the sea became impassable, filled with shallow mud. For centuries, this was dismissed as pure fiction, a moral tale about hubris and divine punishment. But in recent decades, archaeological discoveries have forced scholars to reconsider. What if Plato was recording a genuine tradition? What if the details he provides are clues to a real place? Let us examine the evidence. First, Plato insists repeatedly that this is not fiction. He claims his source is Solon, the Athenian lawmaker, who heard the story from Egyptian priests during his visit to Egypt. The priests claimed to have records going back thousands of years, far older than Greek civilization. They told Solon about a great war between the Atlanteans and the ancestors of the Greeks, and about the catastrophic destruction that followed. Now, we know that Bronze Age civilizations did keep extensive records. We know that Egypt preserved historical traditions going back millennia. And we know that around 1200 BCE, a genuine catastrophe struck the Mediterranean world: the Bronze Age collapse. Entire civilizations vanished. Great cities were destroyed. Writing systems disappeared. It took centuries for the region to recover. Could Atlantis have been one of the civilizations destroyed in this collapse? Many scholars now think it might have been Santorini, also called Thera, a volcanic island in the Aegean Sea. Around 1600 BCE, Santorini exploded in one of the largest volcanic eruptions in human history. The explosion was so powerful that it destroyed the Minoan civilization on nearby Crete. Tsunamis devastated coastal cities around the Mediterranean. Ash blocked out the sun. The climate changed. Crops failed. The Minoans were an advanced Bronze Age civilization. They had palace complexes with sophisticated plumbing, extensive trade networks, art and architecture that influenced the later Greeks. And then, suddenly, they were gone. Could Plato's story of Atlantis be a garbled memory of Minoan Crete and Santorini? The timeline does not match perfectly. Plato says Atlantis sank 9,000 years before his time. Santorini erupted about 1,200 years before Plato. But ancient peoples often exaggerated time periods. And oral traditions, passed down over centuries, tend to inflate dates. But there is a problem with the Santorini theory. Plato specifically says Atlantis was beyond the Pillars of Hercules, in the Atlantic Ocean, not in the Mediterranean. So if we take Plato literally, we need to look elsewhere. Some researchers have proposed the Azores, a group of islands in the Atlantic. These are the peaks of an underwater mountain range. Could there have been more land above water in the past? Geological surveys suggest no. The Azores have been mostly unchanged for millions of years. Others point to Antarctica. Before it was covered in ice, Antarctica was a habitable continent. Ancient maps, like the Peary Race map from 1513, seem to show Antarctica's coastline as it would appear without ice. How could a 16th century cartographer know this? The Peary Race map claims to be based on much older sources, possibly going back to Alexander the Great's time or earlier. Could there have been a civilization in Antarctica before the ice? The geology makes this unlikely. Antarctica froze over millions of years ago, long before humans existed. But a small group of researchers continue to argue that there may have been periods when parts of Antarctica were ice-free more recently, and that evidence of human habitation could be buried under the ice. Then there is the Richat structure in Mauritania, Africa, also called the Eye of the Sahara. It is a massive circular geological formation in the desert, consisting of concentric rings matching Plato's description of Atlantis. Some argue this could be the remains of the Atlantean capital, now landlocked because sea levels have changed over millennia. The problem with all these theories is that they require us to either ignore or reinterpret Plato's account. If we take him literally, Atlantis was in the Atlantic, it sank, and it happened 9,000 years before his time. None of the proposed locations match all these criteria, so either Plato was wrong, or we are looking in the wrong place, or the evidence has been deliberately destroyed or hidden. And this brings us to the conspiracy aspect. Why would anyone want to hide evidence of Atlantis? Some argue that if Atlantis was real and was as advanced as Plato suggests, it would upend our understanding of human history. It would mean that there was a sophisticated civilization at a time when humans were supposedly primitive. It would mean that civilization has risen and fallen multiple times, not just progressed linearly as we are taught. It would mean that knowledge has been lost and rediscovered repeatedly throughout history. This is threatening to those who control historical narratives. If people understand that civilizations can collapse completely, that knowledge can be lost, that we are not inevitably progressing toward a better future, then perhaps they might question current power structures. Perhaps they might wonder whether our own civilization is as stable as we believe. And so, according to conspiracy theorists, evidence of Atlantis has been suppressed. Ancient maps showing its location have been hidden in restricted archives. Archaeological sites that might prove its existence have been declared off-limits. Researchers who get too close to the truth are discredited or silenced. Is any of this true? I cannot say. What I can say is this: Plato's account remains unexplained. Geological and archaeological evidence for catastrophic events in the ancient past continues to accumulate. and our understanding of Bronze Age civilizations continues to reveal that they were far more advanced than previously thought. Whether Atlantis was real or not, the story serves a purpose. It reminds us that civilizations can fall, that knowledge can be lost, that the past is not as simple as we imagine, and that perhaps, just perhaps, there are things about our history that we have deliberately chosen to forget. Atlantis may be a legend, but legends often contain a kernel of truth, and the search for that truth continues. Chapter 3: The Garden of Eden. From a civilization that may never have existed, we turn to a place that billions believe was real. The Garden of Eden, paradise, the birthplace of humanity according to the Abrahamic religions. But if Eden was a real place, where was it? And why has its location been lost? The biblical account in Genesis is frustratingly vague and frustratingly specific at the same time. God plants a garden in Eden, in the east. He places Adam there. The garden contains every tree that is pleasant to sight and good for food, including the tree of life and the tree of knowledge of good and evil. A river flows from Eden and divides into 4 rivers: the Pishon, which flows around the land of Havilah, where there is gold; the Gihon, which flows around the land of Cush; the Tigris, which flows east of Assyria; and the Euphrates. 2 of these rivers we can identify: the Tigris and Euphrates, in modern-day Iraq. So Eden must be somewhere in Mesopotamia, right? Many scholars have placed it at the head of the Persian Gulf, where these rivers converge. But there are problems with this identification. First, the Pishon and Gihon cannot be identified with any certainty. Numerous rivers have been proposed. Some say the Pishon is the Wadi Batin in Kuwait. Others say it is the Indus River in Pakistan. The Gihon is even more contentious. Some identify it with the Nile, others with the Aras River in Armenia, still others with the Karun River in Iran. Second, the geography described in Genesis does not match the current geography of Mesopotamia. A river dividing into 4 branches does not make geological sense. Rivers converge, they do not diverge. Unless we are talking about a river delta, but the Genesis account does not describe a delta. This has led scholars to propose various solutions. Perhaps the geography has changed dramatically since Eden existed. Geological shifts, climate change, rising sea levels, all could have altered the landscape unrecognizably. Or perhaps the Genesis account is using symbolic geography, not literal descriptions. The 4 rivers could represent the 4 directions, with Eden at the center of the world. But what if we take the text more literally and look elsewhere? Some researchers have proposed Armenia. The highlands of eastern Turkey and Armenia are the source region for both the Tigris and Euphrates. They also have mountains, which fit some interpretations of Eden being on a mountain or elevated place. Armenian tradition has long claimed that Eden was located in their land, and the site of the supposed landing of Noah's Ark, Mount Ararat, is also in this region. In the early 20th century, archaeologist David Roll proposed that Eden was in the Tabriz region of northwestern Iran. He identified the Pishon with the Wijun River and the Gihon with the Aras River. He argued that Havilah, the land of gold, was a region known in ancient times for gold mining. The theory is intriguing but remains controversial. Others have looked further afield. Some argue Eden was in East Africa, based on the identification of the Gihon with the Nile and the understanding that humanity originated in Africa. If Eden is the birthplace of humanity and humanity evolved in Africa, then perhaps Eden is a memory of our African origins. Then there are the more exotic theories. Some claim Eden was in Sri Lanka, or the Seychelles, or even Antarctica before it froze. These theories generally rely on mystical or esoteric interpretations rather than mainstream scholarship. But here is the deeper question. If Eden was real, why can we not find it? The Genesis account tells us that after Adam and Eve were expelled, God placed cherubim and a flaming sword at the entrance to guard the way to the tree of life. Does this mean Eden still exists but is protected by divine forces, that it is hidden from us deliberately? Jewish, Christian, and Islamic traditions all teach that Eden cannot be found by ordinary means. Some say it exists in a different dimension, accessible only to the righteous after death. Others say it was destroyed in Noah's flood and is now beneath the ocean. Still others say it exists but is invisible to those who lack spiritual purity. And then there are those who argue that the location of Eden has been deliberately hidden by religious authorities. Why? Perhaps because if Eden were found, it would force a literal interpretation of Genesis that conflicts with scientific understanding. Perhaps because the physical Eden would not match religious expectations, leading to a crisis of faith. Or perhaps because Eden contains something that powerful religious institutions do not want discovered. What would it mean if the tree of knowledge or the tree of life were real plants? What if they produced fruits or substances with genuine biochemical effects? What if ancient peoples had access to entheogenic plants that produced mystical experiences? And the Eden story is a mythologized account of this. Modern scholars know that many ancient religions use psychoactive substances in their rituals. Could the forbidden fruit have been something similar? If this were true, it would reframe the Eden story entirely. It would no longer be about sin and disobedience, but about the control of knowledge and consciousness-altering experiences. It would suggest that religious authorities have been suppressing information about these substances for millennia. I am not claiming this is true. I am simply pointing out that if Eden were found and studied archaeologically, it might reveal uncomfortable truths about the origins of religion and the historical basis of Scripture. And perhaps this is why, despite centuries of searching, its location remains a mystery. Or perhaps Eden was never a specific physical place. Perhaps it is a symbol, a mythologized memory of humanity's transition from hunter-gatherer to agricultural society. The fall would then represent the loss of the relatively easy existence of foraging and the harsh labor required by farming. The expulsion from Eden would be the moment humans chose to plant crops and raise animals, binding themselves to the land and to toil. This interpretation is favored by many scholars, but it does not explain the specific geographic details in Genesis. Why mention 4 rivers if it is all symbolic? Why describe the gold of Havilah? Why locate it in Mesopotamia? The search for Eden continues. Archaeologists and biblical scholars examine ancient texts, study satellite imagery, conduct excavations in promising locations. Occasionally, someone claims to have found it. These claims are always disputed and never conclusively proven. Perhaps we will never know where Eden was. Perhaps it was destroyed long ago, or perhaps it never existed as a physical place. But the Eden story endures because it speaks to something deep in human consciousness. The longing for a lost paradise. The sense that we were once in harmony with nature and with the divine, and that something precious has been lost. And perhaps, just perhaps, that is exactly what those in power want us to believe. That paradise is lost, that we can never return, that we must accept the world as it is, rather than seeking the knowledge and the places that might transform it. Eden may be a memory, but the search for it is a refusal to accept that some knowledge is meant to stay forbidden. Chapter 4: The Tower of Babel. From paradise we descend to the ultimate monument to human hubris, the Tower of Babel. According to Genesis, humanity united to build a tower reaching to heaven. God, displeased with this arrogance, confused their languages so they could no longer understand each other. The project collapsed, humanity scattered across the earth. But was there a real tower? Was there a historical event behind this story? And if so, what happened to it? The biblical account in Genesis 11 is brief. In the plain of Shinar, which scholars identify with Mesopotamia, people speaking one language decide to build a city and a tower with its top in the heavens to make a name for themselves. God sees this and says that if humanity remains united in purpose, nothing will be impossible for them. So he confuses their speech and scatters them. This story has been interpreted theologically as a warning against pride and attempting to reach God's domain. But historically and archaeologically, it likely reflects real structures and events. Mesopotamia, particularly Babylon, was famous for its ziggurats. These were massive stepped pyramids, built as temples, with shrines to the gods at their peaks. The most famous was the Etemenanki, the ziggurat dedicated to Marduk in Babylon. Its name means Temple of the Foundation of Heaven and Earth. It was approximately 90 meters tall, roughly the height of a 30-story building. For ancient peoples, this would have seemed impossibly immense, a structure reaching toward heaven. The Etemenanki was destroyed and rebuilt multiple times. The Assyrian king Sennacherib destroyed it in 689 BCE. The Neo-Babylonian king Nebuchadnezzar II rebuilt it in the 6th century BCE. The Greek historian Herodotus visited Babylon around 450 BCE and described the ziggurat in detail. But by the time of Alexander the Great's conquest in 330 BCE, the Etemenanki was in ruins again. Alexander planned to rebuild it, but died before he could. His successors did not continue the project. Today, nothing remains of the Etemenanki but a flattened earth platform and scattered bricks. Saddam Hussein, in a bizarre attempt to link himself to Nebuchadnezzar, began reconstruction in the late 20th century, but the work was crude and historically inaccurate. Recent wars have further damaged the site. So was the Etemenanki the Tower of Babel. Many scholars think so. The timing fits. The Neo-Babylonian period, when the Etemenanki was at its grandest, was also when many Jews were in Babylonian captivity after the destruction of the First Temple in Jerusalem in 586 BCE. These Jewish exiles would have seen the Great Ziggurat and may have developed the Babel story as both an explanation for linguistic diversity and a critique of Babylonian pride. But there are hints that the tradition is older. The earliest biblical sources may date to the 10th or 9th century BCE, before the Babylonian captivity, and ziggurats existed in Mesopotamia long before Babylon rose to power. The city of Ur had a massive ziggurat built around the 21st century BCE. Eridu, one of the oldest cities in human history, had ziggurats dating back to the 4th millennium BCE. Could the Tower of Babel story be a mythologized memory of these earliest monumental constructions? A story passed down for millennia, growing in symbolism and religious meaning, but rooted in humanity's first attempts to build structures of divine scale. And here is the intriguing part. What if the ziggurat, whichever one inspired the story, was destroyed deliberately to prevent its completion? What if powerful interests did not want humanity to succeed in building a tower that reached the heavens? This sounds absurd until you consider the geopolitical context. Babylon was a center of power, wealth, and knowledge. The ziggurats were not just temples, but also observatories. Mesopotamian astronomers made incredibly accurate measurements of celestial movements from these heights. They predicted eclipses. They understood the precession of the equinoxes. They had mathematical and astronomical knowledge that would not be rediscovered in Europe for centuries after the fall of Rome. What if the destruction of the Tower of Babel, whether it was the Etemenanki or another structure, was not divine intervention, but human sabotage? What if a rival power destroyed it to prevent Babylon from consolidating even more power and knowledge? What if the confusion of languages, refers not to supernatural intervention, but to the scattering of Babylonian scholars and priests after the city's conquest, taking their knowledge to different regions and adapting it to different languages and cultures. This interpretation fits the historical record. Babylon was conquered multiple times. The Assyrians destroyed it and scattered its population. The Persians conquered it. Alexander the Great took it. Rome eventually claimed the region. Each conquest dispersed the knowledge concentrated in Babylon. The great libraries and schools were destroyed or looted. Scholars fled or were enslaved. The unified intellectual tradition fractured into dozens of regional schools, each preserving fragments of the original knowledge but unable to communicate effectively with the others due to language and political barriers. In this reading, the Tower of Babel is not about divine punishment for hubris. It is about the deliberate destruction of a center of learning and power by those who feared its potential. It is about the weaponization of language and cultural division to prevent unified human achievement. It is about the loss of knowledge that occurs when empires rise and fall. And perhaps this is why the tower was erased. Not forgotten, but mythologized to the point where its historical reality becomes obscured. By turning it into a religious parable about divine punishment, the real lessons are hidden. The lesson that power fears unified human effort. That knowledge is destroyed by conquerors. That linguistic and cultural division serves political purposes. Today, the site of ancient Babylon is a ruin in Iraq. War, looting, and neglect have devastated what remains. Archaeological work continues, but much has been irretrievably lost. The Tower of Babel, if it ever stood, is gone. But the story remains. And like all the places on this list, it reminds us that humanity has built great things and lost them over and over again. Perhaps the real Tower of Babel is not a physical structure, but the idea itself. The idea that humanity, united, could achieve the impossible. And perhaps that idea is what has been most thoroughly erased from our memory. Because if we remembered it, we might try again. Chapter 5. Sodom and Gomorrah. We turn now to the cities of sin. Sodom and Gomorrah. According to Genesis, these were cities so wicked that God destroyed them with fire and brimstone. But archaeological evidence suggests that something did destroy cities in this region, catastrophically and suddenly. So what really happened? And why has the truth been buried beneath layers of religious interpretation? The biblical account is dramatic. Abraham's nephew Lot lives in Sodom. God sends two angels disguised as men to warn Lot that the city will be destroyed. The men of Sodom attempt to sexually assault the angels, confirming the city's wickedness. The angels strike the mob blind and tell Lot to flee with his family without looking back. Fire and brimstone rain from the sky. Sodom and Gomorrah are utterly destroyed. Lot's wife looks back and turns into a pillar of salt. For centuries, this was understood purely as moral allegory. The cities were symbols of sin, their destruction a warning. But archaeologists began finding evidence that something catastrophic did happen in the southern Levant, around the time frame suggested by biblical chronology. The cities are traditionally located near the Dead Sea, the lowest point on Earth in the Jordan Valley. This region is part of the Dead Sea Transform, a major geological fault line. Earthquakes are common. The area is also rich in petroleum deposits and natural gas, which occasionally seep to the surface, and the climate is extremely arid, making the region inhospitable except near water sources. In the 20th century, archaeologists identified several Bronze Age cities in the region that showed signs of sudden, violent destruction. The most promising candidate is Tall El Hammam in Jordan, east of the Jordan River. Excavations there have revealed a massive Bronze Age city, far larger than previously expected for the region. The city had massive fortifications, public buildings, a complex water system. It was a significant urban center. And then, around 1700 BCE, it was destroyed, catastrophically. The destruction layer shows evidence of intense heat. Pottery was melted, mud brick walls were vitrified, turned to glass. Skeletal remains show trauma consistent with a massive explosion. The site was abandoned for centuries afterward, suggesting that whatever happened made the area uninhabitable. What could cause such destruction? The excavators initially proposed an earthquake combined with natural gas explosions. The geological fault line could trigger an earthquake, which could rupture underground gas deposits, leading to massive fires. This would match the fire and brimstone description in Genesis. But in 2021, a scientific paper proposed something even more dramatic. An airburst. A meteor exploding in the atmosphere above the city, generating a shock wave and heat pulse that destroyed everything below. The evidence cited includes the high-temperature heating of materials, the presence of shocked quartz, and the sudden abandonment of not just Tall El Hammam, but multiple sites in the region simultaneously. If true, this would be similar to the Tunguska event in Siberia in 1908, where a meteor airburst flattened 2,000 square kilometers of forest. But Tunguska occurred in an uninhabited area. An airburst over the densely populated Jordan Valley would have been catastrophic, potentially killing tens of thousands of people instantly. This theory remains controversial. Not all scientists accept the evidence for an airburst. But what is not controversial is that something destroyed these cities suddenly and violently, and that the destruction was so complete that the area was abandoned for centuries. Now here is where things become interesting from an erasure perspective. If an airburst did occur, it would have been visible across the entire region. It would have been a formative event for every culture in the ancient Near East. And indeed, we have possible evidence of this. The destruction of Tall El Hammam coincides roughly with the end of the Early Bronze Age and the beginning of a long period of decline and depopulation in the southern Levant. Something happened around 1700 BCE that disrupted the entire regional civilization. Yet this event, if it occurred, does not appear clearly in historical records outside the Bible. Egyptian records from this period do not mention it. Mesopotamian texts are silent. Why? If a meteor exploded over one of the most populated regions of the Bronze Age world, why is there not more evidence? One possibility is that the records were lost. Much of what we know about the Bronze Age comes from fragmentary sources. Entire archives have been destroyed, libraries burned, clay tablets scattered or reused. The absence of evidence is not necessarily evidence of absence. But another possibility is that the event was deliberately downplayed or reinterpreted by later powers. If a natural disaster could wipe out major cities in an instant, it undermines the narrative of divine order and human control. It suggests that civilization is far more fragile than we like to believe. That random cosmic events can erase centuries of human achievement in moments. This is a disturbing thought, and perhaps this is why the Sodom and Gomorrah story has been so thoroughly moralized. By framing the destruction as divine punishment for sin, it becomes comprehensible and even comforting. The cities deserved their fate. God was in control. Moral order was maintained. But if the real cause was a meteor, then there was no moral component. The cities were not punished. They were simply unlucky. Humanity was not being judged. We were being reminded that we live on a planet in a solar system where catastrophic impacts occur, and our continued existence is partly a matter of chance. This is an uncomfortable truth, and uncomfortable truths are often erased or mythologized into something more palatable. The physical evidence at Tall El Hammam is being studied, but the story most people know is the biblical one. The fire and brimstone, the pillar of salt, the cities of sin. And perhaps that is precisely the point. By focusing on sin and punishment, we avoid confronting the reality that our civilizations can be destroyed by forces beyond our control or understanding, that the universe does not care about our moral worth, that we are vulnerable. Sodom and Gomorrah, whether they were Tall El Hammam or other cities, were erased not just physically but conceptually. Their real fate was too terrifying to remember accurately. So we invented a story that gave meaning to the meaningless. And in doing so, we forgot that sometimes cities burn, not because they are wicked, but because a rock fell from the sky. The excavations continue. The evidence accumulates. And perhaps, in time, we will recover the truth of what happened in the Jordan Valley 3,700 years ago. But the myth will persist, because myths serve purposes that truth cannot. Chapter 6. Shangri-La. From the scorched earth of the Dead Sea, we travel to the highest mountains on earth, to a place that exists somewhere between legend and longing. A hidden valley where time moves differently, where people live for centuries, where ancient wisdom is preserved. Shangri-La. The name entered Western consciousness in 1933 through James Hilton's novel Lost Horizon. In the book, a plane crash strands travelers in a hidden Tibetan valley called Shangri-La, where a Lama Seri preserves the knowledge and culture of the world, waiting for the day when civilization destroys itself and needs to be rebuilt. Hilton's Shangri-La was fiction, but he did not invent the concept. He drew from genuine Tibetan Buddhist traditions about hidden valleys called Beul, sacred places protected by spiritual forces, accessible only to the pure of heart during times of turmoil. The Beul tradition is ancient. According to Tibetan Buddhism, the great teacher Padmasambhava, who brought Buddhism to Tibet in the 8th century, concealed sacred valleys throughout the Himalayas. These valleys were to serve as refuges during times of war, persecution, or natural disaster. They are hidden not just geographically, but spiritually. You cannot find a Beul by simply walking. You must be karmically ready. The valley must reveal itself to you. This is not mere mysticism. The Himalayas are vast and largely unmapped. Valleys exist that have never been visited by outsiders. The terrain is so difficult that entire communities can live in isolation for centuries. During times of conflict, Tibetan refugees have indeed fled to remote valleys, surviving for generations before contact with the outside world resumed. So is Shangri-La real? Not as Hilton described it, certainly, but is there a specific valley that inspired the legend? Several locations have been proposed. The most famous candidate is the Yarlung Tsangpo Grand Canyon in Tibet, one of the deepest canyons in the world. The Yarlung Tsangpo River carves through the Himalayas, creating gorges so deep and remote that entire ecosystems exist unknown to science. In 1993, explorers discovered that the canyon contains a hidden waterfall taller than Niagara Falls, unmapped and unknown, despite being in one of the most photographed mountain ranges on Earth. The canyon's remoteness and the presence of monasteries and communities that have lived in isolation for centuries make it a plausible location for a Beul. Tibetan tradition specifically names the Pemako region around the canyon as a sacred hidden land. Another candidate is the Hunza Valley in Pakistan, near the border with China. When Westerners first visited in the early 20th century, they found a community that seemed extraordinarily healthy and long-lived. Reports, later disputed, claimed that Hunza people regularly lived past 100 years, rarely suffered disease, and maintained vitality into old age. These reports captivated Western audiences desperate for longevity secrets. The Hunza diet, the Hunza lifestyle, the Hunza water all became subjects of intense interest. Some claimed the valley's isolation had preserved ancient health practices lost elsewhere. Others suggested something in the environment itself promoted longevity. Modern medical investigations have found the longevity claims exaggerated. Hunza people live long lives by regional standards, but not miraculously so. The early reports were based on unreliable age estimates and wishful thinking. Still, the valley's beauty and isolation continue to draw those seeking Shangri-La. Bhutan, the small Himalayan kingdom, has also been identified with Shangri-La. Bhutan deliberately isolated itself from the modern world until the 1970s. It measures national success not by GDP, but by gross national happiness. Its government limits tourism to preserve culture and environment. In many ways, Bhutan has attempted to become Shangri-La deliberately, a refuge from modernity. But here is what makes Shangri-La genuinely interesting: the idea that knowledge is being preserved in isolation, waiting for the right moment to re-emerge. This is not fantasy. Throughout history, knowledge has survived catastrophes, specifically because it was preserved in isolated communities. When the Roman Empire fell, classical knowledge survived in monasteries. When the Mongols destroyed Baghdad and its libraries, Islamic scholarship survived in peripheral regions like Al-Andalus in Spain. When the Chinese Empire collapsed repeatedly, Taoist and Buddhist monasteries in remote mountains preserved texts that would otherwise have been lost. The Tibetan plateau specifically became a repository for Buddhist texts after Buddhism was suppressed in India. Entire libraries of Sanskrit Buddhist literature, lost in India, survived in Tibetan translation. Without these isolated Himalayan monasteries, vast portions of Buddhist philosophy and practice would have vanished entirely. So the core idea of Shangri-La, a hidden place preserving knowledge, is historically validated. What remains speculative is whether there is a single specific location that serves this function, and whether that location is deliberately hidden or simply remote. And this brings us to the erasure question. Why has Shangri-La not been found? The Himalayas have been extensively explored. Satellites have photographed every square meter. Modern technology can penetrate the most remote terrain. One answer is that there is nothing to find. Shangri-La is a composite of many real places and traditions, given literary form by Hilton. Searching for a specific valley is like searching for Gotham City. But another answer, one that appeals to those who believe in Bayul, is that Shangri-La cannot be found by those seeking it for the wrong reasons. The valley reveals itself only to those who need refuge and who are spiritually prepared. A satellite sees only rocks and ice. A GPS unit registers only coordinates. But someone fleeing persecution, someone seeking wisdom, someone pure of heart, that person might walk through a mountain pass and find themselves in a valley that should not exist. This is unprovable and unfalsifiable. It is faith, not science. But it is worth noting that Tibetan refugees fleeing Chinese occupation in the 1950s and 60s did find hidden valleys where they survived for years before resettlement. These were not Shangri-La in the mystical sense, but they functioned as refuges, as places of survival, exactly as the Bayul tradition promised. Perhaps Shangri-La is not a place, but a possibility. The possibility that somewhere, in the most remote corners of the earth, knowledge and peace are being preserved. That not all of humanity has succumbed to modernity's destructive pace. That alternatives exist, even if we cannot find them. And perhaps this is why Shangri-La persists in imagination, despite all evidence against it. Because we need to believe that such places exist. That not everything has been mapped and commodified and destroyed. That mystery remains. That there are still hidden valleys where time moves differently and wisdom endures. Whether Shangri-La is real or not, the search for it reveals something about us. Our longing for refuge. our sense that something precious has been lost in the rush of modern life. Our hope that somewhere, somehow, it is being kept safe. And perhaps that hope is enough. Perhaps Shangri-La exists not in the Himalayas, but in the human need for it to exist. And perhaps that is why it will never be found. Because once found, measured, photographed, and opened to tourism, it would no longer be Shangri-La. It would just be another place. The mystery protects itself. And maybe that is exactly as it should be. Chapter 7, El Dorado. From the snow-covered peaks of the Himalayas, we descend to the sweltering jungles of South America, to a place that drove men mad with greed, a city of gold so rich that its streets were paved with precious metal, and its king covered himself in gold dust. El Dorado, the legend of El Dorado, the Golden One, began shortly after the Spanish conquest of the Americas. Indigenous peoples told the conquistadors about a kingdom in the interior, where gold was so abundant it was treated as common metal. A king who, during ritual ceremonies, would cover his entire body in gold dust and then wash it off in a sacred lake, making offerings of gold and emeralds to the gods. This was not entirely fantasy. The Muisca people of present-day Colombia did practice such rituals. At Lake Guatavita, high in the Andes, chieftains would coat themselves in gold dust and paddle to the center of the lake on a raft, then dive into the water, washing off the gold as an offering. The lake bottom accumulated centuries of gold artifacts. The Spanish heard these accounts and became obsessed. If one lake contained such wealth, what about an entire city? What about a kingdom where gold was so common that streets, buildings, even ordinary objects were made from it? El Dorado transformed from a person, the Golden Man, into a place, the Golden City. Expeditions set out to find it. Gonzalo Pizarro, brother of the conquistador of Peru, led a disastrous expedition into the Amazon in 1541. Hundreds of Spaniards and thousands of indigenous porters died from disease, starvation, and attacks. They found no gold, only jungle. Francisco de Orellana, who separated from Pizarro's expedition, became the first European to navigate the Amazon River from the Andes to the Atlantic. He reported seeing large settlements along the river, evidence of substantial indigenous civilizations. But these civilizations did not have golden cities. They had complex societies adapted to the rainforest, societies that would largely collapse within a century of European contact due to disease and slavery. Sir Walter Raleigh launched 2 expeditions searching for El Dorado in the Guianas in 1595 and 1617. He was convinced the city was located in the interior of Guyana, possibly near the Orinoco River. He failed to find it. His second expedition violated peace treaties with Spain, leading to his execution upon return to England. Dozens of other expeditions followed over the centuries. All failed. The jungle killed more Europeans than gold enriched. El Dorado remained elusive. So was there ever a golden city? Almost certainly not in the form the Spanish imagined. But was there something real behind the legend? Absolutely. First, Lake Guatavita and the Muisca gold ritual were real. In 1690, Spanish entrepreneurs actually drained part of the lake, finding gold artifacts on the exposed lakebed. The technique was crude and the lake refilled, but it proved the indigenous accounts were not fabrications. Second, pre-Columbian South American civilizations did have sophisticated gold work. The Muisca, the Quimbaya, the Tairona, the Zenu, all produced intricate gold jewelry and artifacts. Gold was sacred, associated with the sun and with divine power. It was used in religious ceremonies and to denote status. But gold was not used for architecture or everyday objects. It was too soft. Stone, wood, and clay were the primary building materials. There were no golden streets or golden buildings. The Spanish, projecting their own values onto indigenous cultures, imagined that if gold was sacred and valuable to indigenous peoples, they must have accumulated it in vast quantities. This was a fundamental misunderstanding. Indigenous societies valued gold for spiritual and artistic reasons, not economic ones. They had no concept of hoarding wealth as the Spanish did. Gold was created into beautiful objects, which were then often given as offerings to gods, thrown into lakes, or buried with the deceased. It was not stored in treasuries. So, El Dorado, as a physical city of gold, never existed. But could there have been wealthy indigenous cities in the Amazon that the Spanish never found? This is increasingly likely. For centuries, scholars believed the Amazon rainforest could not support large populations or complex civilizations. The soil is poor. Agriculture would be impossible at scale. Any settlements would have to be small and scattered. But recent archaeological work has overturned this view completely. LiDAR technology, which can map the ground surface beneath jungle canopy, has revealed vast earthworks throughout the Amazon. Geometric patterns, roads, moats, and mounds indicating large permanent settlements. Some of these sites cover hundreds of square kilometers. These were not golden cities, but they were sophisticated urban centers. They practiced terra preta agriculture, creating enriched soils that allowed intensive farming. They constructed fish weirs, dams, and canals to manage water resources. They had social hierarchies, craft specialization, and trade networks spanning thousands of kilometers. The chroniclers who accompanied early Spanish expeditions did report large settlements along the Amazon. For a long time, historians dismissed these as exaggerations, but the LiDAR evidence confirms them. The Amazon was densely populated before European contact. The forest we see today is actually regrowth, recovering from the demographic collapse caused by introduced diseases. Within a century of European contact, perhaps 90% of the indigenous population of the Americas died from smallpox, measles, typhus, and other diseases to which they had no immunity. Entire civilizations collapsed, cities were abandoned, forests reclaimed fields and roads. By the time later European explorers penetrated the interior, they found only scattered remnants of what had been thriving populations. So in a sense, El Dorado did exist, not as a golden city, but as a network of sophisticated Amazonian civilizations. And these civilizations were erased, not by deliberate suppression, but by disease, and the subsequent regrowth of the jungle that hid all evidence of their existence. But there is another layer to the El Dorado erasure. As it became clear that no golden city would be found, the Spanish and later European powers shifted narratives. The indigenous peoples went from being potential sources of wealth to being obstacles to resource extraction. The Amazon went from being a place of imagined golden cities to being an empty wilderness, terra nullius, land belonging to no one, available for exploitation. By erasing the memory of complex Amazonian civilizations, by treating the rainforest as empty and primitive, colonial powers justified the seizure of land and the enslavement or elimination of indigenous peoples. If there had never been cities there, if the people were savages without civilization, then there was no moral problem with taking the land. This erasure continues. Even today, the Amazon is often depicted as pristine wilderness, untouched by human hands. This narrative serves those who want to exploit its resources without regard for indigenous peoples who have lived there for millennia. It ignores the archaeological evidence that the Amazon was shaped by human activity for thousands of years, that what we call wilderness is actually a managed landscape. El Dorado, the Golden City, never existed. But the erasure of what did exist, the sophisticated pre-Columbian civilizations of the Amazon, is a genuine historical crime. And the ongoing denial of indigenous presence and rights continues this erasure into the present. The legend of El Dorado also reveals something about European psychology. The Spanish brought their own greed to the Americas and imagined that indigenous peoples must organize their societies around the same values. They could not conceive of cultures that did not hoard wealth, that valued beauty and spirituality over accumulation. This failure of imagination led to catastrophic consequences. And it raises a question. How many other civilizations have been erased not because they were inferior, but because conquerors could not understand them? How many other El Dorados, places and peoples dismissed as primitive or non-existent, actually represented different and perhaps superior ways of organizing human society? The Golden City was a lie. But what lies beneath the lie is far more valuable than gold. It is the memory of civilizations that thrived in harmony with environments that modern society considers too hostile for development. It is the knowledge that human culture can take forms radically different from our own. It is the reminder that wealth is not the only value, that beauty and community and spiritual connection to the land might matter more. And perhaps this is the real reason El Dorado can never be found. Not because it does not exist, but because to truly find it, we would have to abandon the greed that drove the search in the first place. We would have to see gold not as treasure, but as an offering. We would have to value the jungle not for what we can extract from it, but for what it teaches us. El Dorado is still out there. Not in the Amazon, but in the possibility of a different relationship with wealth, with nature, with each other. And until we are ready to see that, we will keep searching for golden cities and finding only emptiness. Chapter 8. Lemuria and Mu. Now we venture into the realm of lost continents, vast land masses that supposedly sank beneath the ocean, taking entire civilizations with them. Lemuria and Mu. These are not ancient legends. They were invented in the 19th century by scientists trying to solve legitimate geological puzzles. But they quickly escaped scientific control and became the foundation for mystical beliefs and conspiracy theories that persist to this day. Let us start with Lemuria. In 1864, a British zoologist named Philip Sclater noticed something odd. Lemurs, a type of primate, were found in Madagascar and India, but nowhere in between. How did they get to both places? Sclater proposed that there must have once been a land bridge connecting Madagascar, India, and Southeast Asia, allowing animals to migrate. He called this hypothetical landmass Lemuria. This was a reasonable scientific hypothesis in 1864, before the theory of plate tectonics. Scientists knew that sea levels had changed throughout geological history. They knew that land bridges had existed at various times. The Bering Land Bridge connected Asia and North America during ice ages, allowing humans and animals to migrate between continents. So why not a land bridge in the Indian Ocean? But as geological knowledge advanced, the Lemuria hypothesis became unnecessary. We now know that India was once connected to Africa and Madagascar as part of the supercontinent Gondwana. As Gondwana broke apart, India drifted northward and eventually collided with Asia, forming the Himalayas. The distribution of lemurs reflects this ancient continental configuration, not a sunken land bridge. So, scientifically, Lemuria is obsolete, but before science rejected it, occultists embraced it. Helena Blavatsky, founder of Theosophy, incorporated Lemuria into her cosmology. In her 1888 book, The Secret Doctrine, she claimed that Lemuria was the homeland of the third root race of humanity, beings who were hermaphroditic, egg-laying, and spiritually advanced, but physically primitive. According to Blavatsky, Lemurians existed millions of years ago. They were not fully material but semi-spiritual beings. They had psychic powers and direct communication with higher spiritual realms. Eventually, they degenerated morally and physically, losing their spiritual powers and becoming trapped in material bodies. Lemuria then sank beneath the ocean as punishment for their decline. Blavatsky claimed to have received this information from ancient Tibetan texts shown to her by spiritual masters. Needless to say, no such texts have ever been produced or verified, but her writings inspired generations of occultists who elaborated on the Lemuria legend, adding details, timelines, and spiritual teachings supposedly derived from Lemurian sources. Mu is a related but distinct concept. In 1864, the same year Sclater proposed Lemuria, a French scholar named Charles-Étienne Brasseur de Bourbourg mistranslated a Mayan text. He believed he had discovered evidence of a lost continent in the Pacific Ocean, which the Maya called Mu. Later, scholars proved his translation was completely wrong. There was no Mu in Mayan mythology. But the damage was done. Augustus Le Plongeon, an amateur archaeologist, expanded on the Mu theory, claiming that Mu was the original homeland of the Maya and that survivors of Mu's sinking had fled to Central America and Egypt, founding both civilizations. He claimed to have deciphered Mayan inscriptions describing Mu's destruction. His translations were nonsense. Professional Mayanists proved this conclusively. But Le Plongeon's widow and other occultists continued promoting the Mu theory. James Churchward, a British occultist, wrote extensively about Mu in the 1920s and 30s. He claimed to have seen ancient tablets in India describing Mu as a vast Pacific continent, with 64 million inhabitants, destroyed 12,000 years ago by volcanic eruptions and earthquakes. No such tablets have ever been found. Churchward's descriptions of Mu's location, size, and geology are impossible according to modern plate tectonics. There was no continental landmass in the Central Pacific that sank 12,000 years ago. The Pacific Ocean floor is ancient oceanic crust, not continental rock. So both Lemuria and Mu are geological impossibilities. Yet belief in them persists. Why? Several reasons. First, they appeal to the idea that ancient civilizations were more advanced than we believe. If Lemuria and Mu existed, then recorded history is incomplete. There were great civilizations before Sumer and Egypt, civilizations that possessed wisdom we have lost. Second, they provide origin stories for mystical and spiritual movements. Theosophists and New Age believers claim spiritual descent from Lemurian and Muon masters. They believe that hidden teachings from these lost civilizations are preserved by secret societies or channeled from spiritual realms. Third, they offer an alternative to mainstream science and history. For people who distrust academic institutions or who feel that important truths are being suppressed, Lemuria and Mu represent forbidden knowledge, truths that they don't want you to know. But here is the irony. While Lemuria and Mu never existed, there is a genuine lost continent, Zealandia. It is a large continental fragment in the southwestern Pacific, mostly submerged, with only New Zealand and a few smaller islands above water. Zealandia separated from Antarctica and Australia millions of years ago and gradually sank beneath the ocean due to tectonic forces. Zealandia is real, mapped, and scientifically documented. But it sank long before humans evolved, so there were no Zealandian civilizations. Still, it proves that large landmasses can sink. The idea of lost continents is not inherently absurd. There is also Sunderland, a large landmass in Southeast Asia that was above water during the last ice age when sea levels were lower. Sunderland connected what are now Indonesia, Malaysia, and parts of mainland Asia. As the ice melted and sea levels rose, Sunderland was gradually submerged, leaving only the islands we see today. Sunderland was inhabited by humans. Archaeological evidence shows that sophisticated maritime cultures existed there. When it flooded, these populations had to migrate, possibly influencing the development of civilizations in mainland Asia. So in a sense, Sundaland is a real lost continent with real human consequences. Why then do people cling to the fictional Lemuria and Mu when real lost lands like Sundaland exist? Perhaps because the real story is not mystical enough. Sundaland's flooding happened gradually over thousands of years as ice sheets melted. There was no sudden catastrophe, no punishment for spiritual decline, no lost wisdom. Just slow geological processes and human adaptation. Lemuria and Mu offer narrative satisfaction. They explain things. They provide meaning. They suggest that current civilizations are not the pinnacle of human achievement, but merely the latest in a series of rises and falls. They humble us while simultaneously suggesting that we might reclaim lost knowledge. And perhaps this is why they were erased, or rather, why they persist despite being debunked. Because the need for them is psychological, not evidential. We want there to be lost continents. We want ancient wisdom. We want to believe that the past holds secrets that could transform the present. The scientific community has thoroughly discredited Lemuria and Mu. Geologists can show definitively that no continents have sunk in the locations proposed. Marine archaeologists have surveyed the ocean floors. Satellite altimetry has mapped underwater topography. There are no hidden continents. But for believers, this evidence is either ignored or reinterpreted as part of the cover-up. If scientists deny Lemuria, it must be because they are hiding the truth. If no physical evidence exists, it must have been deliberately destroyed or is being kept in secret archives. This is unfalsifiable reasoning, and it illustrates a broader point about erasure and forbidden knowledge. Sometimes places are not erased by authorities. Sometimes people erase reality and replace it with myths because the myths are more emotionally satisfying. Lemuria and Mu never existed, but the human need for them to have existed is real. And that need tells us something important about ourselves. We are a species that requires meaning, mystery, and the possibility of hidden wisdom. When reality does not provide these, we invent them. And perhaps in the end, that is the real lesson of lost continents. Not that they existed, but that we need to believe they existed. And as long as that need persists, Lemuria and Mu will never be truly erased. They will exist where they have always existed, in imagination, in longing, and in the refusal to accept that everything has already been discovered. Chapter 9. Shambhala. We return to the Himalayas, but this time not to Shangri-La, the literary invention, but to Shambhala, the genuine ancient tradition. A kingdom hidden in the mountains, where enlightened beings preserve the purest teachings of Buddhism, waiting for the prophesied moment when the world descends into chaos, and Shambhala's king will emerge with an army to restore Dharma. This is not James Hilton. This is centuries-old Buddhist cosmology. And it raises a disturbing question. What if Shambhala is not mystical, but political? What if it was a real kingdom that was deliberately erased from history for reasons of power? The earliest references to Shambhala appear in the Kalachakra Tantra, a text that entered Tibetan Buddhism in the 11th century, but claims much older origins. According to the tradition, the Buddha taught the Kalachakra teachings to the king of Shambhala, who took them back to his kingdom in the north. There, a line of enlightened kings preserved and practiced these teachings for centuries. The Kalachakra Tantra describes Shambhala in detail. It is a circular kingdom surrounded by snow mountains, divided into 8 petal-like regions around a central capital. The palace of the king is made of precious jewels. The inhabitants are spiritually advanced, living long lives in peace and prosperity. The kingdom is protected by geographical remoteness and by spiritual forces that prevent the unworthy from finding it. But the Kalachakra Tantra also includes specific prophecies. At a future time, as the world descends into warfare, materialism, and spiritual corruption, the 25th king of Shambhala will emerge with his army. He will defeat the forces of darkness and establish a golden age of Dharma on earth. This prophesied war is described in vivid detail, including weapons and tactics that, to modern readers, sound disturbingly like descriptions of advanced military technology. Tibetan Buddhists have taken Shambhala seriously for centuries. The Dalai Lamas have performed the Kalachakra initiation repeatedly, connecting disciples to the Shambhala lineage. Many Tibetans believe Shambhala is a real place, and various locations have been proposed. Some say it is in the far north of Tibet, beyond the Kunlun Mountains. Others place it in the Altai Mountains of Mongolia or Russia. Some Mongolian traditions locate it in the Gobi Desert or the Tarim Basin. In the 20th century, Shambhala became entangled in geopolitical intrigue. Nicholas Roerich, a Russian painter and mystic, launched expeditions to Central Asia in the 1920s, ostensibly searching for Shambhala, but possibly also gathering intelligence for the Soviet Union. His expeditions were well funded and had suspiciously good access to restricted areas. Heinrich Himmler's SS also became interested in Shambhala as part of the Nazis' obsession with Aryan origins and lost civilizations. Ernst Schaefer led a German expedition to Tibet in 1938, officially for zoological research, but widely believed to have occult and strategic purposes. The Nazis believed that Shambhala might hold secrets of ancient Aryan power. After World War II, rumors circulated that both the United States and the Soviet Union continued searching for Shambhala during the Cold War, believing it might hide advanced technology or strategic geographic positions. These rumors are unverified, but they illustrate how a mystical concept became militarized and politicized. So, is Shambhala real? Let us separate the layers. First, as a spiritual concept, Shambhala is definitely real. It has shaped Tibetan Buddhist practice for a millennium. The Kalachakra initiation is one of the most important teachings in Tibetan Buddhism, and it explicitly connects practitioners to the Shambhala lineage. Whether you believe in the literal kingdom or not, the spiritual tradition is genuine and ancient. Second, was there ever a historical kingdom that inspired the Shambhala legend? Possibly. The Kalachakra Tantra entered Tibet from Kashmir in the 11th century. Kashmir at that time was a center of Buddhist learning with connections to Central Asia and beyond. The text may preserve memories of a Central Asian Buddhist kingdom that existed before Islam spread through the region. In the 7th and 8th centuries, Central Asia was home to numerous Buddhist kingdoms. The Tarim Basin, in what is now Xinjiang, China, was a thriving center of Buddhism. Cities like Khotan, Kashgar and Turfan had large Buddhist populations, monasteries, and libraries. These kingdoms were wealthy, cosmopolitan, and culturally sophisticated. Then came the Islamic conquests. By the 10th and 11th centuries, most of Central Asia had converted to Islam, often by force. Buddhist monasteries were destroyed, texts were burned, entire Buddhist cultures were erased. The remnants fled eastward to Tibet or were absorbed into Islamic civilization. Could Shambhala be a mythologized memory of these lost Buddhist kingdoms? Could the prophecy of Shambhala's king returning be a coded longing for the restoration of Central Asian Buddhism? This interpretation is speculative but plausible. There is also a darker possibility. What if Shambhala was deliberately erased by Islamic conquerors, and the mystical tradition is all that remains? What if there was a specific powerful Buddhist kingdom in Central Asia that Islamic powers targeted, destroying it so thoroughly that only legends survived? We know this happened to other places. The Nalanda University in India, one of the greatest centers of learning in the ancient world, was completely destroyed by Islamic invaders in the 12th century. thousands of monks were killed. The library burned for months. The site was abandoned and forgotten until archaeological rediscovery in the 19th century. If Nalanda could be erased, why not an even more remote kingdom in the mountains of Central Asia? If the goal was to eliminate Buddhist resistance and ensure Islamic dominance, erasing the memory of a powerful Buddhist kingdom would be strategically sound. This is, admittedly, speculation. We have no direct evidence of a historical Shambhala kingdom, but we do have evidence of systematic destruction of Buddhist cultures in Central Asia. We have evidence of texts being burned and monasteries destroyed. We have evidence of refugees fleeing to Tibet, bringing traditions and texts with them. And we have the persistent Tibetan belief that Shambhala is real and will one day return. This is not passive mysticism. This is active longing for political and spiritual restoration. For Tibetans who have suffered under Chinese occupation since 1950, the Shambhala prophecy offers hope. It suggests that current suffering is temporary, that righteousness will ultimately prevail, that an enlightened army will one day liberate the oppressed. The Chinese government is aware of this symbolism. Tibetan teachings about Shambhala are sometimes restricted or monitored. The Kalachakra initiation, when performed by the Dalai Lama, is understood to have political dimensions. It is not just spiritual practice, but a statement of continuity with an ancient tradition and a claim to legitimacy that the Chinese government does not recognize. So Shambhala, whether it ever existed as a physical place or not, is now a site of political contestation. The Chinese government would prefer that Tibetans forget about Shambhala, accept Chinese rule, and abandon prophecies of future liberation. In this sense, Shambhala is being erased in real time, not through military conquest of a place, but through cultural suppression of an idea. And this raises a profound question. Can you erase a place that exists primarily in consciousness? If Shambhala is not a specific geographic location, but a spiritual ideal, how do you destroy it? You cannot bomb it. You cannot burn its libraries, because its knowledge is transmitted orally and initiatically. You cannot kill its king, because the king exists in an unbroken lineage of reincarnation. The only way to erase Shambhala is to eliminate the people who believe in it. This is what the Chinese government has attempted, not through genocide in the physical sense, but through cultural genocide, suppressing Tibetan Buddhism, forcing secular education, relocating populations, destroying monasteries, imprisoning teachers. Yet Shambhala persists. The Dalai Lama continues to give Kalachakra initiations in exile in India and around the world. Tibetan refugees preserve the teachings. Western converts study the tradition. Shambhala has gone global, beyond the reach of any government to control. Perhaps this is the ultimate irony of erasure. By attempting to destroy Shambhala, Chinese authorities have internationalized it. By making it forbidden, they have made it more precious. By trying to erase it from memory, they have ensured it will be remembered. Shambhala may never be found. It may not exist as a physical place, but as an idea, as a hope, as a promise that righteousness will ultimately prevail. It cannot be erased. It exists wherever people refuse to accept that power and oppression are the final words. It exists wherever people preserve wisdom in the face of violence. It exists wherever people wait and prepare and believe that a better world is possible. And perhaps that is exactly what Shambhala always was. Not a hidden kingdom in the mountains, but the indestructible human capacity for hope. Chapter 10. Agartha. Beneath our feet, according to certain traditions, lies another world, an underground civilization far more advanced than anything on the surface. A subterranean kingdom called Agartha, ruled by the king of the world, where technology and spirituality have merged into a society that makes our own look primitive. This is one of the most persistent and bizarre legends in alternative history. And what makes it truly strange is that otherwise credible people, including explorers, scientists, and political leaders, have taken it seriously. The Agartha legend as we know it today was popularized in the late 19th and early 20th centuries by several European occultists and explorers. But the idea of underground civilizations is much older. Many cultures have myths of subterranean peoples. Greek mythology had Hades. Norse mythology had Svartalfheim, home of the Dark Elves. Hindu cosmology describes multiple levels of existence below the earth. Buddhist traditions speak of Nagas, serpent beings who live underground and guard ancient treasures and wisdom. The modern Agartha narrative began with Louis Jacques, a French author who in 1873 published books claiming that ancient Hindu texts described an underground world called Asgartha, ruled by an order of enlightened beings. Jacques' scholarship was dubious, his translations questionable, and much of his work was likely fabricated. But he established key elements: a hidden underground civilization, superior knowledge, and a ruling elite that guides surface humanity from below. In 1924, French occultist Alexandre Saint-Yves d'Alvedre published Mission de l'Inde, claiming that Agartha was a vast underground kingdom beneath the Himalayas, inhabited by millions of people. According to Saint-Yves, Agartha was the source of all wisdom and civilization. Its libraries contained the accumulated knowledge of past ages. Its ruler, the Brahmatma or King of the World, directed the course of human history through a network of initiates and secret societies on the surface. Saint-Yves claimed to have been given this information through telepathic contact with the Agartha hierarchy. He described the underground cities, their architecture, their technology, their social organization. He wrote that Agartha had existed for thousands of years, surviving through catastrophes that destroyed surface civilizations. He claimed that representatives of Agartha occasionally emerged to guide humanity during critical moments. Shortly after, Polish explorer Ferdynand Ossendowski published Beasts, Men and Gods in 1922, describing his experiences in Mongolia during the Russian Civil War. Ossendowski claimed that Mongolian lamas had told him about the King of the World, a figure living in a subterranean realm called Agarthi. He described prophecies about future upheavals and the eventual emergence of the King of the World to establish peace on Earth. Ossendowski's book was widely read and influenced numerous subsequent writers. Nicholas Roerich, the same explorer who searched for Shambhala, also wrote about Agartha. He believed it was connected to a network of underground tunnels and cities beneath Asia. The Nazis, predictably, became interested. Some occult-minded members of the SS believed that Agartha might be the homeland of the Aryans, and that making contact with this superior underground race could provide Germany with advanced technology and esoteric knowledge. There is no credible evidence that they ever found anything, but the obsession demonstrates how seriously some powerful people took the legend. After World War II, the Agartha legend merged with UFO mythology. Some began claiming that flying saucers originated not from other planets, but from underground bases. Admiral Richard Byrd's Antarctic expeditions were reinterpreted as having discovered entrances to a hollow Earth. Conspiracy theories proliferated, claiming that governments knew about underground civilizations and were suppressing the truth. So, let us be clear, there is no scientific evidence for Agartha. The Earth is not hollow. Seismology has mapped the planet's interior. We understand the structure: crust, mantle, outer core, inner core. There are no vast caverns capable of supporting cities, no hidden continents, no underground seas lit by internal suns. Large cave systems do exist. The Mammoth Cave System in Kentucky is over 600 kilometers long. Vietnam's Son Doong Cave is large enough to contain a Boeing 747. But these are geological features. not habitations of advanced civilizations. And even the largest caves are tiny compared to the underground realms described in Agartha legends. So why does the legend persist? Several psychological and cultural factors. First, it taps into the deep human sense that there are hidden layers of reality, that the world we see is not all there is, that somewhere beyond our perception, greater truths exist. This is fundamentally a spiritual or Gnostic impulse, the belief in hidden knowledge available only to the initiated. Second, it provides an explanation for advanced ancient civilizations. If Agartha exists, then the sophisticated knowledge evident in ancient structures, from the pyramids to Göbekli Tepe, could have come from underground masters teaching surface humanity. This removes the need to credit past humans with genius, allowing people to believe that advanced knowledge requires supernatural or extraterrestrial sources. Third, it offers hope that someone is in control. The idea of the king of the world guiding human history suggests that despite apparent chaos, there is a plan. This is comforting, especially during times of upheaval. Rather than accepting that history is random and humans are ultimately alone in making decisions, the Agartha legend suggests that benevolent beings are steering us towards enlightenment. But there is a darker interpretation. What if the Agartha legend is deliberate misinformation? What if powerful groups encourage belief in underground masters precisely to distract people from seeking real hidden knowledge? If people think secret wisdom is locked in a mythical underground kingdom, they will not investigate real conspiracies and real suppression of knowledge. This is the problem with myths like Agartha. They can be used to discredit legitimate inquiry. If you question official narratives, you might be lumped in with people who believe in hollow earth and subterranean Nazis. This tainting by association is an effective way to suppress critical thinking. And this brings us to the erasure question. Is Agartha a place that was erased from history, or is it a fiction created to erase something else? If Agartha never existed, what purpose does the legend serve? Why do people need to believe in it? Perhaps the answer lies in what Agartha represents symbolically. The underground is the unconscious. It is the hidden parts of ourselves, the knowledge we have suppressed, the potential we have not developed. Agartha is not beneath the Himalayas. It is beneath the surface of our own minds. In this reading, seeking Agartha is seeking self-knowledge. The king of the world is the integrated self, the highest potential of human consciousness. The underground civilization is the untapped capacity of the human species, waiting to be actualized. This is a psychological interpretation, not a literal one, but it might explain why the legend resonates. We sense that we are not living up to our potential, that there is wisdom and capability within us that we have forgotten or suppressed. That if we could only access our inner Agartha, we could transform ourselves and our world. Whether Agartha is real or not, the search for it reveals something profound about human nature. We need mystery. We need to believe in hidden depths. We need to imagine that somewhere, someone knows the answers. And we need to believe that knowledge is not lost, but merely hidden, waiting to be rediscovered by those worthy of finding it. Agartha cannot be erased because it was never there to begin with. But the human longing that created Agartha, that is real. And that longing will create new Agarthas, new hidden kingdoms, new secret wisdoms. As long as humans exist and feel that the surface of reality is not enough, the underground remains unexplored, not beneath our feet but within ourselves. Chapter 11. Iram of the Pillars. From underground kingdoms, we emerge into the desert, to a city that may have actually existed, that was mentioned in the Quran itself, but that vanished so completely that for centuries it was dismissed as myth. Until, in 1992, satellite imagery revealed something extraordinary beneath the sands of Oman. Iram of the Pillars. the Atlantis of the sands. The Quran describes Iram in Surah Al-Fajr. Have you not seen how your Lord dealt with Ad, with Iram of the pillars, the like of which was never created in the land? According to Islamic tradition, Iram was built by the people of Ad, a tribe of giants who lived in the empty quarter of Arabia. They were powerful, wealthy, and arrogant. They built their city with lofty pillars and towers unlike anything else in the world. But the people of Ad rejected the prophet Hud, who warned them to worship God alone and to treat others justly. They mocked him. They boasted of their strength and their magnificent city. So God sent a punishment, a catastrophic windstorm that lasted 7 nights and 8 days, burying Iram beneath the sand and destroying the people of Ad utterly. The city vanished so completely that travelers in the empty quarter could find no trace of it. For centuries, Islamic scholars debated whether Iram was a real city or a symbolic tale. The geographical descriptions were vague. The empty quarter, the Rub al-Khali, is one of the largest sand deserts in the world, covering much of southern Arabia. Finding anything beneath those shifting dunes seemed impossible. European Orientalists in the 19th and 20th centuries generally dismissed Iram as legend. No archaeological evidence existed, no inscriptions mentioned it. The only source was religious text, which they did not consider reliable historical documentation. But Arabian tradition insisted Iram was real. Bedouin tribes told stories of occasionally seeing towers and pillars emerging from the sand during sandstorms, only to be buried again. They spoke of ruins in the desert, dangerous to approach, guarded by jinn. These were dismissed as superstition. In 1992, everything changed. Nicholas Clapp, a documentary filmmaker and amateur archaeologist, became obsessed with finding Iram. He obtained declassified satellite images taken by NASA for geological surveys. Using these images and comparing them with ancient trade routes mentioned in historical texts, he identified a site in Oman called Shisar, where faint traces of ancient caravan routes converged. Clapp partnered with professional archaeologists and secured funding for excavations. What they found at Shisar was extraordinary. The remains of a significant ancient city, including a fortress with 8 towers. Beneath the fortress was a massive limestone cavern. The city had been built over this cavern, using it as a water source. But at some point, the cavern roof collapsed, swallowing parts of the city and cutting off the water supply. The city was abandoned. Carbon dating placed the site's primary occupation between 3000 BCE and 300 CE, with the collapse occurring around 300 CE. This matched the time frame suggested by some Islamic traditions for the destruction of Iram. Was this Iram of the pillars? The excavators were cautious. The ruins were impressive, but not unprecedented. The fortress had towers, which could be interpreted as pillars. The site was clearly a major center on the frankincense trade route, which would explain wealth and importance. And the catastrophic collapse explained the sudden abandonment and burial. But other scholars pointed out problems. The Quran describes Iram as having pillars, the like of which was never created in the land. The Shisar fortress, while substantial, was not architecturally unique. Similar structures existed elsewhere in the ancient Near East, and the location, while in the general region of the empty quarter, was not in the deepest desert where Bedouin traditions placed Iram. Still, the discovery was significant. It proved that substantial cities had existed in southern Arabia in antiquity. It demonstrated that oral traditions about lost desert cities were not pure fantasy, and it showed that satellite archaeology could uncover sites that traditional methods had missed. Whether or not Shisar is the Quranic Iram, the question remains: why was this city forgotten? Why did it take until 1992 to rediscover it? The answer lies in the nature of the desert itself. Sand is constantly moving. Dunes migrate. Sandstorms bury and uncover features unpredictably. A city could be visible one year and buried the next. Without permanent landmarks or written records that survived, locating anything in the empty quarter was nearly impossible until aerial and satellite imaging became available. But there is also a historical dimension to the forgetting. After the rise of Islam, Arabia's center of power shifted. Mecca and Medina became the focal points. The old trade routes declined as maritime trade routes developed. The frankincense trade that had made southern Arabian cities wealthy diminished. The region depopulated. Knowledge of specific sites was lost. Moreover, the Islamic narrative about Iram was theological, not historical. The point of the Quranic story was moral. Pride and injustice lead to destruction. Whether Iram was a literal city or a parable was less important than the lesson, so there was no strong religious motivation to search for its ruins. Finding Iram would not prove or disprove Islam. It was simply an illustration in a larger moral teaching. But for Western Orientalists, Iram became a symbol of Arabian fantastical storytelling. Like the 1001 Nights, it was exotic fiction, evidence that Arab and Islamic sources were unreliable for historical purposes. This Orientalist dismissal meant that serious archaeological investigation was delayed for decades. In this sense, Iram was erased not by sand, but by scholarly prejudice. Western academics did not believe the city existed, so they did not look for it. And because they did not look, they assumed their disbelief was justified. It took an outsider, a filmmaker, with no academic credentials, to actually investigate systematically. This is a recurring pattern in archaeological history. Sites dismissed as mythical by professional scholars are discovered by amateurs willing to take ancient texts seriously. Troy was found by Heinrich Schliemann, a businessman, after professional archaeologists had declared Homer's Iliad pure fiction. Hattusa, the Hittite capital, was found by following biblical references that academics had dismissed as unreliable. The lesson is clear. Absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. Just because we have not found something does not mean it does not exist. And dismissing ancient texts as unreliable without investigation is intellectual arrogance. But here is the deeper mystery about Iram. If it was real, and if it was as magnificent as the Quran suggests, why are there no contemporary records of it? Egyptian texts do not mention it. Mesopotamian records are silent. Greek and Roman geographers, who documented many Arabian sites, do not describe an Iram with unprecedented pillars. One possibility is that Iram of the Pillars was not the city's contemporary name, but a later designation. The name might refer to a dynasty or a region rather than a specific city. Archaeological sites rarely have signs saying, "This is Iram." We identify ancient cities by cross-referencing multiple sources. If those sources were lost or never created, identification becomes speculative. Another possibility is that Iram's fame was regional, known in Arabia, but not beyond. Not every significant city makes it into distant empires' records. The Iram story was preserved in Arabian oral tradition and later codified in the Quran, but contemporary written records may never have existed or may have been lost. Or perhaps Iram is still undiscovered. The empty quarter is vast. Satellite imagery has revealed countless archaeological features, many unexcavated. Perhaps the true Iram, the city of unprecedented pillars, lies still beneath the sand, waiting for the right combination of technology and luck to reveal it. What we know for certain is this: substantial cities existed in ancient Arabia. They were wealthy from trade. They were abandoned when economic and environmental conditions changed. And they were buried by sand, preserved but hidden, until modern technology allowed us to see through the desert. Iram reminds us that the earth still holds secrets, that beneath deserts, beneath jungles, beneath oceans, there are places we have not yet found, that our maps of history are incomplete, and that sometimes the legends are true, not exactly as told perhaps, but rooted in genuine places and events that time and nature tried to erase. The Atlantis of the sands may yet be found, and when it is, we will have to reconsider how much of what we call myth is actually forgotten history. Chapter 12. The Land of Punt. Now we turn to Africa, to one of the most tantalizing mysteries in ancient history, the Land of Punt. Mentioned repeatedly in ancient Egyptian texts as a source of precious goods, a place of wealth and wonder, somewhere along the coast of the Red Sea, or perhaps beyond. But where exactly? Despite thousands of years of Egyptian records documenting trade with Punt, we still cannot locate it with certainty. How does an entire kingdom, one that traded with Egypt for over a millennium, vanish without a trace? The Egyptians called Punt Ta-Netjer, God's land. They first mention it in the 25th century BCE, during the Old Kingdom, and references continue through the New Kingdom, ending around the 11th century BCE. Egyptian texts describe Punt as a source of myrrh, frankincense, gold, ebony, ivory, wild animals, and exotic goods. It was clearly a place of considerable wealth and importance. The most detailed account comes from the mortuary temple of Queen Hatshepsut at Deir el-Bahari, dating to the 15th century BCE. The temple walls contain extensive reliefs depicting an expedition to Punt. We see Puntite dwellings built on stilts, suggesting a coastal or riverine location prone to flooding. We see the people of Punt, their physical appearance carefully rendered. We see exotic trees being transplanted into pots to bring back to Egypt. We see the loading of ships with frankincense, myrrh, and other goods. The Puntites are shown bringing tribute to the Egyptian expedition: gold rings, ivory, ebony, panther skins, live baboons, and greyhounds. The king and queen of Punt are depicted meeting the Egyptian envoys. Queen Ati of Punt is portrayed as unusually corpulent, which has led to medical speculation about conditions like elephantiasis or Dercum's disease, though it may simply be artistic representation of wealth and status. So we have detailed imagery, we have lists of goods, we have descriptions of the journey, and yet we cannot definitively locate Punt. How is this possible? The problem is that Egyptian geographical descriptions are imprecise by modern standards. They give directions relative to the Nile and Egypt, but they do not use coordinates or consistent distance measurements. They describe the journey in terms of duration and landmarks, but these landmarks cannot always be identified. Most scholars place Punt in the Horn of Africa, specifically in modern Somalia, Djibouti, or Eritrea. This region produces frankincense and myrrh naturally. The Red Sea coast location matches references to Punt being reached by sea voyage from Egypt. The depictions of Puntite dwellings on stilts fit the architecture found in parts of the Horn of Africa. And the goods traded, particularly incense, ivory, and exotic animals, are consistent with East African sources. But some scholars argue for alternative locations. The southern Arabian coast in modern Yemen or Oman also produces frankincense and myrrh. Trade routes across the Red Sea could have connected Egypt to Arabian Punt just as easily as to African Punt. Some Egyptian texts seem to describe Punt as requiring both sea and land travel, which complicates a simple coastal location. A minority of scholars have even proposed more distant locations: coastal Kenya, Tanzania, or even Mozambique. These theories are generally based on the idea that Punt was not a single kingdom but a trading network, with Punt referring to wherever certain goods originated, which could shift over time. The mystery deepens when we consider that Punt was not an Egyptian colony or conquered territory. It was an independent kingdom or confederation of kingdoms that maintained trade relations with Egypt for over 1,000 years. This was not sporadic contact, but regular, sustained interaction. Egyptian expeditions to Punt occurred repeatedly under multiple pharaohs. This was a known quantity, not an exotic unknown. So why do we have no Puntite texts? Why have we not found inscriptions, monuments, or archaeological sites that definitively identify themselves as Punt? Several possibilities exist. First, Punt may not have had writing, or may have used perishable materials like papyrus or wood that have not survived. Second, we may have found Puntite sites, but cannot recognize them as such because we lack inscriptions explicitly naming the place. Third, the name Punt may be Egyptian, not the name the inhabitants used for themselves, so local inscriptions would use a different name entirely. There is also the possibility that Punt was systematically destroyed or depopulated, and the memory of it was lost. Around 1100 BCE, the Bronze Age collapse disrupted civilizations across the Eastern Mediterranean and Near East. Trade networks broke down, literacy declined, many cities were abandoned. It is possible that Punt, dependent on international trade, collapsed during this period and was never rebuilt. If the kingdom fragmented, if the people dispersed, if the cities fell into ruin, then within a few generations, no one would remember where Punt had been. But there is another, more troubling possibility. What if Punt was deliberately erased? What if later powers wanted no memory of this African kingdom that had traded as equals with Egypt? Colonial-era European scholars were deeply invested in narratives of African inferiority. The idea that sophisticated African kingdoms had existed in antiquity, engaging in long-distance trade and producing goods valued by great civilizations, contradicted racist assumptions about African history. If Punt could be dismissed, ignored, or relocated to Arabia, then Africa's ancient history could be minimized. And indeed, for a long time, many European scholars did prefer Arabian locations for Punt, despite evidence favoring African locations. This was not necessarily conscious conspiracy, but unconscious bias shaping interpretation of evidence. Modern African scholars have worked to reclaim Punt as part of African heritage. They point out that the goods traded, the geographical descriptions, and the artistic depictions all fit East African locations better than Arabian ones. They argue that Punt represents proof of ancient African wealth, sophistication, and international engagement, countering narratives that portray pre-colonial Africa as isolated and primitive. Recent archaeological work in Somalia and Eritrea has uncovered ancient ports and trading centers. Some of these sites date to the right time period and show evidence of trade with Egypt and other civilizations. But definitive identification requires more evidence, and political instability in the region has hindered excavation. Perhaps the most intriguing recent development is genetic research. Studies of baboons mummified in ancient Egypt have traced their origins using DNA analysis. Baboons were not native to Egypt but were imported, often from Punt. By determining where these baboons came from, scientists hope to locate Punt. Early results point to Eritrea and eastern Ethiopia, supporting the Horn of Africa hypothesis. If Punt can be definitively located through such methods, it will be a remarkable achievement. A kingdom lost for 3,000 years, rediscovered not through texts or ruins, but through the DNA of animals it once exported. This would prove that modern scientific techniques can solve ancient mysteries that traditional archaeology cannot. But whether or not Punt is found, its story illustrates a broader problem: the fragility of memory. Punt was not a minor place. It was a significant trading partner of one of the greatest civilizations in history, mentioned in records spanning over a millennium. Yet we lost it. We know it existed. We know it was important, but we do not know where it was. How many other places have we lost? How many kingdoms have left no trace except a name in someone else's records? How much of human history is simply gone, not because it was deliberately erased, but because time and forgetting are more powerful than we imagine? Punt reminds us that even with extensive documentation, even with detailed artwork, even with sustained contact over centuries, memory can fail, information can be lost, places can vanish, and once lost, recovering them requires extraordinary effort and luck. The search for Punt continues. Archaeologists work in difficult conditions in East Africa, uncovering fragments of ancient trade networks. Scientists analyze mummies and artifacts, extracting data unimaginable to previous generations. Historians re-examine texts, looking for clues that were overlooked. And perhaps, one day, someone will stand in a ruined city by the Red Sea and know, with certainty, this was Punt. This was God's land. This was the place the Egyptians sought for 1,000 years. Until then, Punt remains what it has been for 3 millennia, a name, a mystery, and a reminder that even the most well-documented places can be erased from the map of history. Chapter 13, Thule. From the heat of the Red Sea, we travel to the frozen north, to the edge of the known world in ancient geography, to an island so remote that reaching it meant crossing into a realm where the sea itself froze and the sun never set. Thule, the ultimate north, the boundary of civilization, a place that may have been real, may have been misidentified, or may have been purely symbolic. And yet, it shaped European imagination for 2,000 years. The first mention of Thule comes from Pytheas of Massalia, a Greek merchant and explorer who lived in the 4th century BCE. Around 330 BCE, Pytheas undertook an extraordinary voyage from the Mediterranean northward along the Atlantic coasts of Europe. He visited Britain, circumnavigated it, and then sailed further north to a place he called Thule. Pytheas described Thule as a 6-day sail north of Britain. He reported that at Thule, the sun barely set during summer, creating nearly continuous daylight. He described the sea around Thule as sluggish and impassable, neither fully liquid nor fully solid, perhaps referring to sea ice or thick fog. He mentioned that the inhabitants lived on the edge of survival, cultivating little, relying on fish, milk, and honey. Unfortunately, Pytheas's own account of his voyage does not survive. We know his descriptions only through later Greek and Roman writers who quoted him, often skeptically. Many ancient authors thought Pytheas was lying. His claims seemed impossible. Britain was already considered at the edge of the world, somewhere even further north, where the sea froze and the sun did not set. Absurd. But was it? If we take Pytheas's description literally, where was Thule? Several candidates have been proposed. The most common identification is Iceland. A 6-day sail from northern Britain or the Orkney Islands could reach Iceland, depending on wind and currents. Iceland certainly experiences midnight sun in summer. The surrounding waters can be clogged with sea ice, fitting Pytheas's description of a sluggish sea. But there are problems with Iceland. No archaeological evidence suggests Greek or Carthaginian contact with Iceland in the 4th century BCE. The island's first confirmed permanent settlement was by Norse Vikings in the 9th century CE, though there is evidence of earlier Irish monks. If Pytheas reached Iceland, it left no trace. Another candidate is Norway, specifically the region around Trondheim or even further north. The midnight sun is visible in northern Norway. The description of inhabitants relying on fish and limited agriculture fits Scandinavian subsistence patterns. And Norway was certainly accessible to ancient mariners. The Faroe Islands, Shetland Islands, or even northern Scotland have also been proposed. These are closer to Britain than Iceland, making the journey more plausible for ancient ships. All experience extended daylight in summer, though not true midnight sun, except at the most northern latitudes. Some scholars suggest that Thule was not a single location, but a generalized concept, the northernmost land known to Greeks at the time, wherever that might be. Pytheas may have combined reports from multiple locations into a single description, creating a composite Thule that cannot be pinpointed because it never existed as described. But here is what makes Thule culturally significant. It became a symbol. For medieval and Renaissance Europeans, Thule represented the edge of the world. Ultima Thule, the furthest Thule, meant the absolute limit of travel and knowledge. To go beyond Thule was impossible. Thule was where civilization ended and the unknown began. This symbolic Thule shaped European imagination profoundly. It represented both a goal and a boundary. Explorers aspired to reach Thule, to prove they had gone as far as anyone could go. But Thule also marked the limit beyond which humans should not venture, the point where the natural order dissolved into chaos. As exploration advanced, Thule shifted. When Vikings settled Iceland and Greenland, these became the new Thule. When explorers reached the Arctic, the North Pole itself became Thule. The concept remained even as the location moved ever northward. And then came the Nazis. In 1918, Rudolf von Sebottendorf founded the Thule Society in Munich, an occult group that combined German nationalism, anti-Semitism, and esoteric beliefs. The society claimed to be recovering ancient Germanic wisdom and preparing for the return of a mythical Aryan civilization. Several early members of the Nazi Party, including Rudolf Hess, were associated with the Thule Society. The Nazis appropriated Thule as part of their mythology of Aryan origins. They claimed that the original Aryan race had come from the far north, from Thule, and that Germans were their direct descendants. This was used to justify claims of racial superiority and territorial expansion. The search for Thule became entangled with pseudo-archaeological expeditions seeking to prove Aryan origins. After World War II, the Thule myth became contaminated by its Nazi associations. Serious scholarly discussion of Pytheas's Thule continued, but any mystical or nationalist interpretations were now tainted. Thule as a symbol largely disappeared from respectable discourse, yet the mystery remains. Did Pytheas reach Iceland, Norway, somewhere else? His voyage, if accurately reported, was one of the most remarkable feats of ancient exploration. To sail from the Mediterranean to the Arctic Circle in the 4th century BCE would have required extraordinary navigational skill, courage, and luck. The voyage would have crossed vast stretches of open ocean in ships that modern sailors would consider barely seaworthy. That ancient and medieval writers doubted Pytheas is understandable. His claims were almost beyond belief. But the fact that we now know his descriptions of Britain were largely accurate suggests that he was a genuine explorer, not a fabricator. If he was right about Britain, why assume he was wrong about Thule? The problem is evidence. We have no artifacts from Pytheas's voyage, no physical proof that he went where he claimed, no inscription on Thule saying Pytheas was here. We have only later quotes of his lost book, filtered through skeptical authors who may have altered or misunderstood his words. In this sense, Thule was erased not by deliberate suppression, but by the simple loss of Pytheas's original text. If his book had survived, we might know exactly where Thule was. We might have detailed descriptions that would allow definitive identification, but the book is gone, and with it, the truth about Thule. This is the most common form of erasure, accidental loss. Books burn, manuscripts decay. Libraries are destroyed not by conspiracy but by fire, flood, war, neglect. The vast majority of ancient literature is lost not because anyone wanted it gone, but because preserving knowledge across centuries is difficult. Still, there are those who wonder, did someone deliberately destroy Pythias's account? Was there knowledge in his book that later powers did not want preserved? Knowledge of northern lands, of trade routes, of resources? Did Romans or later Christians suppress his work because it contradicted their geography or threatened their claims of discovery? There is no evidence for this. Occam's razor suggests the simpler explanation. The book was copied infrequently, and eventually all copies were lost. This happened to countless ancient works. We are lucky to have even the fragments quoted by later authors. But Thule survives in another form, in imagination, as the ultimate north, the unreachable place, the boundary of the possible. Every culture has its Thule, a place that represents the limit of the known world. For medieval Christians, it was the earthly paradise, unreachable but believed to exist. For early modern explorers, it was Terra Australis, the great southern continent. For modern humans, it is other planets, distant stars, the edge of the observable universe. Thule reminds us that there are always edges to our maps, always places we have not reached, always knowledge we have not gained, and that the drive to reach those edges, to go beyond Thule, is fundamentally human. Whether Thule was Iceland, Norway, or somewhere else, the search for it pushed the boundaries of ancient exploration. Pythias ventured into the unknown and returned with knowledge. That knowledge was largely lost, but the impulse that drove him remains. And perhaps that is what Thule truly represents. Not a place, but the human refusal to accept boundaries. The desire to see what lies beyond. The willingness to sail north until the sea freezes, just to know what is there. Thule may never be definitively located, but its legacy is secure. It is the North Star of exploration, the unreachable goal that draws us forward. And as long as humans wonder what lies beyond the horizon, Thule will endure. Chapter 14. Avalon. From the frozen north, we return to the British Isles, but now to a place wrapped in legend, in magic, and in longing. The Isle of Avalon, where King Arthur was taken after his final battle, to be healed of his mortal wounds, where he sleeps still, according to legend, waiting for the moment when Britain needs him most. A place that may have been real, may have been symbolic, or may have been both, and whose location has been claimed, disputed, and forgotten more times than any other site in British history. The earliest references to Avalon appear in Geoffrey of Monmouth's Historia Regum Britanniae, written around 1136 CE. Geoffrey describes Avalon as the island of apples, a blessed isle where Arthur's sword Excalibur was forged, and where Arthur was taken after the Battle of Camlan to recover from his wounds. Geoffrey identifies it as Insula Avalonis, using the Latin word for island and the Celtic word for apple. In Celtic mythology, apples are associated with the other world, with immortality, with the realm of the gods and the dead. An island of apples would be a liminal place between the mortal world and the divine. Avalon, in this interpretation, is not primarily a geographical location, but a spiritual one, a mythologized version of the Celtic otherworld. But was there a real place behind the myth? The leading candidate has been Glastonbury in Somerset, England. Glastonbury Tor, a distinctive hill rising from the Somerset levels, has been associated with Avalon since medieval times. In the 12th century, the monks of Glastonbury Abbey claimed to have discovered Arthur's tomb in their grounds, complete with an inscribed cross identifying the grave. This discovery is deeply suspicious. The abbey had recently been damaged by fire and needed funds for rebuilding. A royal tomb attracting pilgrims would generate significant income. The timing was convenient. The evidence was questionable. Modern scholars generally consider The discovery, a medieval fraud, a pious deception to raise money and prestige. Yet the Glastonbury-Avalon connection persisted. The town embraced it. Pilgrims came, stories grew. By the 16th century, Glastonbury was firmly established in popular imagination as the Isle of Avalon, and there are tantalizing geographical reasons why this identification might have been made originally. In ancient times, before drainage and land reclamation, the Somerset levels were extensively flooded. Glastonbury Tor would have been an island or peninsula surrounded by marshland and water, an island in a very real sense. The area was also known for apple orchards, so Island of Apples could literally describe Glastonbury's landscape. Moreover, Glastonbury has pre-Christian religious significance. Archaeological evidence shows occupation dating back to Neolithic times. The Tor has unusual terracing that some interpret as the remains of an ancient labyrinth or sacred pathway. Iron Age and Roman artifacts have been found. This was clearly a special place long before Christianity arrived. Early Celtic Christianity also has connections to Glastonbury. Tradition claims that Joseph of Arimathea came to Britain after Christ's crucifixion and founded the first Christian church in Britain at Glastonbury. This tradition is historically dubious but culturally powerful. It made Glastonbury one of the most important pilgrimage sites in medieval England. So Glastonbury has genuine historical and religious significance. It was geographically an island. It was associated with apples. It had pre-Christian sacredness. These factors likely combined to create the Glastonbury-Avalon identification, whether or not Arthur was actually buried there. But other locations have been proposed for Avalon. Some identify it with Ynys Môn, Anglesey, an island off the coast of Wales that was a centre of Druidic power. Others suggest Burgh Island in Devon, Lundy Island in the Bristol Channel, or even distant islands like the Isles of Scilly or Ireland's Isle of Man. French scholars have proposed that Avalon was actually Ile d'Aval in Brittany, connecting Arthurian legend to continental Celtic traditions. Others argue that Avalon was purely mythical, a literary creation by Geoffrey of Monmouth with no intended geographical referent. The question of Arthur's historicity further complicates the matter. Was there a real Arthur? Most historians think there may have been a British war leader in the late 5th or early 6th century who fought against Anglo-Saxon invaders. This figure, through centuries of embellishment, became the legendary King Arthur. But if the historical Arthur existed, we know almost nothing about him. He left no confirmed archaeological trace. He is mentioned in no reliable contemporary texts. So if Arthur himself is uncertain, how can Avalon be identified? Perhaps we are asking the wrong question. Perhaps Avalon was never meant to be found. Perhaps it is, by definition, unreachable. A place you go when you die or when you are beyond mortal healing. A place that exists but cannot be visited by ordinary means. This interpretation fits the myth better than any geographical location. Avalon in Arthurian legend functions like Valhalla in Norse mythology or Elysium in Greek mythology. It is the afterlife for heroes, or at least a place of suspended existence between life and death. Arthur does not die at Camlan. He is taken to Avalon to be healed, and he remains there, sleeping, until Britain's need is so great that he must return. This is the once and future king motif. Arthur is not dead, he is waiting. And when the moment comes, when Britain faces its darkest hour, Arthur will wake and return. This belief has recurred throughout British history. During the English Civil War, royalists believed Arthur would return to restore the monarchy. During World War II, some claimed Arthur's spirit was fighting alongside Britain against Nazi Germany. The belief that Arthur still lives in Avalon is psychologically powerful. It provides hope. It suggests that even in defeat, even in the apparent end, there is the possibility of return, of restoration, of a leader who will make things right. This is why the Avalon myth endures, not because of geography, but because of what it represents, the refusal to accept that defeat is final. But there is a darker reading. What if Avalon was deliberately made unfindable? What if successive British powers wanted the Arthur legend to remain vague and mythical rather than historically concrete? A real Arthur, with a known tomb and definite historical evidence, could be used to challenge authority. If Arthur was real and his burial place known, then his legacy belongs to whoever controls that site. Better to keep Avalon mysterious, to keep Arthur mythical, so that every claimant can invoke him without any definitive proof contradicting the claim. This is speculative, but it is worth noting that Arthurian legend has been used politically throughout British history. Different factions have claimed Arthur's legacy. The Tudors claimed descent from Arthur to legitimize their rule. The English used Arthur to justify conquest of Wales, claiming to be restoring ancient British unity. Arthur has been Saxon, Norman, English, British, Celtic, depending on who needed him. By keeping Avalon unlocatable, by ensuring that Arthur's historical reality remained uncertain, those in power maintained flexibility. Arthur could be whatever they needed him to be, without awkward historical facts interfering. Whether or not this was deliberate, the effect is clear. Avalon cannot be found because Avalon was never meant to be found. It exists in the space between history and myth, between reality and longing. It is Glastonbury and not Glastonbury, a real place and an imagined one simultaneously. And perhaps that is exactly right. Perhaps Avalon is the place where wounded kings go to heal, not a specific island, but the space of recovery, of waiting, of hope. We all have our Avalons, places we retreat to when wounded, where we heal and gather strength before returning to the world. Arthur sleeps in Avalon, and Britain waits, in every generation, for his return. And whether he ever actually lived or not, the waiting itself is real. The hope itself is real. And perhaps that is all Avalon ever was, the place where hope rests until it is needed again. Avalon cannot be erased because it was never entirely present. It shimmers at the edge of vision, half remembered, half imagined. And that is where it belongs. Not on any map, but in the human heart's insistence that endings are not final, that heroes can return, and that somewhere just beyond our reach, the wounded king still sleeps. Chapter 15. The City of the Caesars. For our final destination, we travel to the southern tip of South America, to Patagonia, a land of windswept plains and impenetrable forests, a region so remote and hostile that even today, vast areas remain uninhabited. And somewhere in this wilderness, according to legend, lies a city of immense wealth, a city of gold, silver, and diamonds, a city founded by Spanish shipwreck survivors or Inca refugees, cut off from the world, thriving in isolation. The city of the Caesars, Trapalanda, the last great lost city of South America. The legend emerged in the 16th century, shortly after Spanish conquest of the Inca Empire. Several origin stories circulated. One version claimed that survivors of a Spanish ship wrecked in the Strait of Magellan made their way inland and founded a city. Another said that Inca nobles, fleeing Spanish conquest, escaped south into Patagonia with their treasures and built a new capital. Still another version told of a city built by the ancestors of the Patagonian tribes, filled with riches beyond imagination. The name City of the Caesars may derive from Francisco Cesar, a Spanish explorer who in 1529 claimed to have found a rich land in the interior of what is now Argentina. His account, likely exaggerated, sparked rumors of a wealthy city waiting to be discovered. Later expeditions sought this city, finding nothing. But the legend persisted. In the 17th and 18th centuries, numerous expeditions set out to find the city of the Caesars. Spanish and Chilean explorers penetrated deep into Patagonia, enduring terrible hardships. Some claimed to have seen the city from a distance, glittering with gold, but were unable to reach it. Others reported that indigenous peoples spoke of a great city in the mountains or beyond the forests. But no expedition returned with proof. The indigenous peoples of Patagonia, the Tehuelche, Mapuche, and others, did have oral traditions about sacred places and hidden valleys. Some of these traditions may have been misinterpreted by Spanish explorers desperate to find wealth. A sacred site described with ceremonial language could easily be transformed through misunderstanding and wishful thinking into a golden city. By the 19th century, the legend began to fade. Patagonia was increasingly explored and mapped. No city was found. The region's harsh climate and limited resources made the existence of a large, wealthy civilization implausible. The city of the Caesars was consigned to the realm of folklore, like El Dorado and Cibola. But was there ever anything real behind the legend? Several possibilities exist. First, there may have been Spanish shipwreck survivors who established a settlement in Patagonia. The Strait of Magellan was notoriously dangerous. Ships were wrecked regularly. Some survivors might have made it to shore and lived among indigenous peoples or founded isolated communities. These settlements, if they existed, would have been small and would eventually have been absorbed into indigenous populations or perished. Second, Inca refugees might have fled south. After Francisco Pizarro conquered the Inca Empire, resistance continued for decades. Some Inca nobles retreated to remote regions, including the eastern slopes of the Andes and the Amazon. It is conceivable that some went as far south as northern Patagonia. But establishing a city in hostile territory with limited resources would have been nearly impossible. Third, the legend may have been inspired by indigenous cities or ceremonial centers that the Spanish never reached. The Mapuche and other southern tribes did have permanent settlements and complex social structures. While they did not build stone cities like the Inca, they had fortified sites and important gathering places. A Spanish explorer seeing one of these from a distance, or hearing descriptions from indigenous informants, might have imagined something grander than reality. Fourth, and most cynically, the legend may have been fabricated or encouraged by colonial authorities to justify continued exploration and military expeditions into Patagonia. If there was a wealthy city to be found, then sending men and resources into the region was reasonable. If no such city existed, then the expeditions were expensive wastes. By keeping the legend alive, authorities could maintain interest and funding. There is also the possibility that the city of the Caesars was confused with other locations. The Chiloé archipelago in southern Chile had relatively prosperous indigenous societies and later Spanish settlements. Seen from the mainland, Chiloé might have seemed mysterious and wealthy. Or the legend might have conflated different reports from different regions, creating a composite city that never existed as described. Modern archaeology in Patagonia has uncovered no evidence of a lost city, no ruins, no caches of treasure, no artifacts suggesting a major settlement in the interior. The region's archaeological record shows indigenous occupation going back thousands of years, but no sign of a Spanish or Inca city. So the city of the Caesars almost certainly never existed. It was a mirage, born of desperate hope, embellished by rumor, sustained by misunderstanding. Like so many legendary places, it reveals more about the people searching for it than about any geographical reality. But why did the legend persist for so long? Why did expeditions continue for centuries despite finding nothing? The answer lies in what the city of the Caesars represented: the possibility of unclaimed wealth. The dream that somewhere in the last unexplored corners of the New World, a fortune was waiting. This was the same impulse that drove the search for El Dorado, for Cibola, for every legendary city of gold. Spanish conquest of the Americas was motivated primarily by greed. The incredible wealth looted from the Aztec and Inca empires convinced conquistadors that more riches must exist. Every new region explored might hold another Cusco, another Tenochtitlan. So they kept looking, kept believing, kept launching expeditions, even as evidence mounted that no more great civilizations remained undiscovered. The city of the Caesars was the last gasp of this delusion. By the 17th century, the major indigenous civilizations had been conquered. The easy gold was gone. But Patagonia remained largely unknown. Perhaps there in the cold and wind-blasted south, the final treasure waited. It did not. Patagonia held no gold, no diamonds, no lost cities. It held indigenous peoples trying to survive in a harsh environment. And eventually, it held Spanish and Chilean settlers, ranchers and soldiers who would displace and destroy those indigenous cultures. The search for the city of the Caesars contributed to this destruction. Expeditions entering Patagonia brought disease, violence, and disruption. Later colonization, justified partly by the need to fully explore and control the region, led to the near genocide of Patagonian peoples. The conquest of the desert in Argentina, completed in the 1880s, was a military campaign that killed thousands of indigenous people and seized their lands. So while the city of the Caesars never existed, the search for it had real and terrible consequences. This is a pattern we have seen repeatedly in this investigation. Legendary places used to justify real violence. The search for El Dorado devastated Amazonian peoples. The search for golden cities in North America contributed to the destruction of indigenous cultures. And the search for the city of the Caesars helped justify the colonization of Patagonia. In this sense, the city of the Caesars was not erased. It was never there to erase. But the indigenous peoples of Patagonia were erased, or nearly so. Their cultures, languages, and histories were suppressed. Their lands were taken, and one of the justifications used was the need to explore the region fully, to ensure that no hidden wealth remained unclaimed. The city of the Caesars represents the final extension of European colonial fantasy into the last unmapped regions of South America. It is the endpoint of a logic that began with Columbus and concluded only when every corner of the Americas had been explored, exploited, and claimed. And when the fantasy finally died, when it became undeniable that no golden cities remained to be found, colonization continued anyway. Because by then, it was not about finding existing wealth. It was about extracting wealth from the land itself, regardless of who lived there. Today, Patagonia is known for its stark beauty, its glaciers, its wildlife. Tourists visit to see landscapes largely unchanged since the Ice Age. But this pristine wilderness narrative itself is a form of erasure. It erases the indigenous peoples who lived there for thousands of years. It erases the violence of colonization. It treats Patagonia as an empty land, discovered by Europeans, rather than a homeland taken by force. The city of the Caesars, ironically, has become part of Patagonia's tourist mythology. Hotels and lodges use the name. Tour companies offer City of the Caesars expeditions, tongue-in-cheek adventures for travelers who want to imagine they are explorers. The legend has been sanitized, turned into harmless folklore, divorced from the historical context of conquest and genocide. This is perhaps the ultimate erasure, taking a legend born of colonial greed, stripping it of its violent history, and repackaging it as entertainment. The city of the Caesars has been transformed from a justification for atrocity into a brand name. But the truth remains. There was no city. There was only the belief in a city, and the violence that belief inspired. And now there are only stories. Stories about what was never there, and silence about what was. We have journeyed to 15 places that civilization tried to erase from memory. Some were real and were forgotten. Others were never real, but served purposes so powerful that their legends persist despite all evidence against them. And others occupy that uncertain space between history and myth, where we cannot say with certainty whether they existed or not. What have we learned? First, that memory is fragile. Great cities can be lost, entire civilizations can vanish, libraries can burn, taking with them knowledge that can never be recovered. The Library of Alexandria was real, and its destruction wounded human memory in ways we cannot fully comprehend. Punt was real, and we have lost it so thoroughly that we do not even know which continent it was on. Second, that desire shapes memory. We invent places like Atlantis, Lemuria, Agartha, because we need them to exist. We need to believe that ancient civilizations were more advanced than we acknowledge. That secret wisdom exists, hidden from us. That somewhere, beyond the reach of our corrupt and failing world, perfection endures. These beliefs tell us more about ourselves than about the past. They reveal our dissatisfaction with the present, our longing for something better, our refusal to accept that we might be alone in our struggles. Third, that erasure serves power. The Victorian sanitization of fairy lore was not accidental. The dismissal of indigenous accounts of sophisticated Amazonian civilizations was not neutral scholarship. The suppression of knowledge about pre-Columbian Africa was deliberate. Throughout history, those in power have shaped what is remembered and what is forgotten. Fourth, that the search for lost places can cause real harm. The quest for El Dorado devastated South America. The search for Shambhala and Agartha was weaponized by fascists. The hunt for the city of the Caesars contributed to genocide in Patagonia. Legends are not harmless. They have consequences. And when those legends are wielded by empires and armies, the consequences are measured in lives destroyed and cultures erased. But fifth, and perhaps most importantly, we have learned that the search itself is essential. Because mixed in with the fantasy and the violence, there are real discoveries. Iram of the Pillars was found. Sodom and Gomorrah may have been found. Troy was found, against all scholarly skepticism. The pattern repeats. What academics dismiss as myth is sometimes revealed to be historical fact, waiting for someone willing to look. So, we must continue searching. Not with the greed of conquistadors or the arrogance of colonizers, but with genuine curiosity and respect for what we might find. We must take ancient texts seriously, even when they describe things that seem impossible. We must listen to indigenous peoples when they tell us about sacred places and lost histories. We must use modern technology, satellite imagery, DNA analysis, LIDAR, to peer beneath the surface of the earth and recover what has been buried. Because the past is not dead. It is not even past. It is beneath our feet, in our DNA, in the fragments of texts that survived the burnings, in the oral traditions passed down through generations. And recovering it is not just academic exercise. It is reclaiming our full human heritage. It is understanding that we are the inheritors of countless civilizations, some remembered, most forgotten. And that our current civilization is not the pinnacle of human achievement, but simply the latest chapter in a much longer story. The 15 places we have visited tonight are not unique. There are hundreds more, thousands more. Entire continents of history that have been lost or suppressed or deliberately erased. And every one of them has something to teach us, if only we are willing to listen. The Library of Alexandria teaches us that knowledge is fragile and must be protected. Atlantis teaches us to question narratives of inevitable progress. The Garden of Eden teaches us that our religious texts may contain historical memories beneath their spiritual teachings. The Tower of Babel teaches us that empires destroy knowledge when they conquer. Sodom and Gomorrah teach us that natural disasters can be mythologized into moral lessons. Shangri-La teaches us that isolated communities preserve what broader civilizations destroy. El Dorado teaches us that greed blinds us to the value of what is already there. Lemuria and Mu teach us that humans need mysteries, even false ones. Shambhala teaches us that hope cannot be conquered. Agartha teaches us that the search for external answers often distracts from internal work. Iram of the Pillars teaches us that satellite archaeology can recover what ground exploration missed. Punt teaches us that even well-documented places can be lost. Thule teaches us that boundaries are meant to be crossed. Avalon teaches us that some places exist in the space between reality and longing. And the City of the Caesars teaches us that the search for wealth often costs more than the wealth itself could be worth. 15 places, 15 lessons. And beneath all of them, one truth. Civilization does not want you to remember. Because if you remember that great libraries were burned, you might ask who burns libraries today and what they are hiding. If you remember that sophisticated civilizations existed and were destroyed, you might question narratives about who is civilized and who is savage. If you remember that knowledge has been lost repeatedly throughout history, you might become more urgent about preserving what we still have. This is why these places were erased, not because they were unimportant, but because remembering them makes us dangerous. Dangerous to power, dangerous to orthodoxy, dangerous to those who profit from our ignorance. So remember. Remember the library. Remember Punt. Remember that vast portions of human history have been lost. Remember that oral traditions often contain truth that written records do not. Remember that the map of the past is incomplete, and that incompleteness is not accidental. And when you stand in a museum and see artifacts from lost civilizations, or when you read an ancient text that describes a place no one can find, or when you hear indigenous elders speak of sacred sites that archaeologists dismiss, remember. Remember that we have lost more than we have kept. Remember that forgetting is the default state, and remembering is an act of resistance. The 15 forbidden places are not on any map. Some never were. Some once were but have been erased. Others exist only in imagination or in dimensions we cannot access. But all of them exist in memory, in the human refusal to accept that any place, any knowledge, any civilization should be allowed to vanish completely. We are the guardians of what remains, the inheritors of fragments, the archaeologists of forgetting. And our task is not simply to find lost places, but to ensure that what we have is not lost in turn. To write down the oral traditions before the last speakers die. To preserve the texts before they crumble. To protect the sacred sites before they are bulldozed for development. Because the next civilization, assuming there is one, will look back at us the way we look back at the Library of Alexandria. They will wonder what we knew that they have lost. They will search for our cities beneath the sand or beneath the rising ocean. They will try to decipher our texts and understand our beliefs. And they will ask the same question we ask about our ancestors. Why did they allow so much to be lost? Let us give them a better answer than we have received. Let us be the civilization that remembered, that preserved, that refused to let the flames of forgetting consume everything we inherited. Let us build libraries that will last millennia, not by making them fireproof, but by distributing knowledge so widely that no single disaster can destroy it all. The 15 forbidden places are a warning and a promise. A warning that everything can be lost, and a promise that everything lost can, potentially, be found again. As long as we keep searching, as long as we keep remembering, as long as we refuse to accept that the past is gone and the map is complete, There are more lost places waiting to be discovered, more libraries buried under sand, more cities sleeping beneath jungle canopy, more knowledge hidden in manuscripts in restricted archives, more oral traditions dying with the last elders, more sacred sites being destroyed in the name of progress. The investigation continues. The search goes on, and somewhere, in the vast unexplored spaces that still remain despite satellites and GPS and the illusion of a fully mapped world, the next forbidden place waits, waiting for someone to remember that it was deliberately forgotten, waiting for someone to ask why, waiting for someone to refuse to accept that it should stay erased. I am Mr. Ravenhurst, and this has been the investigation into 15 places that civilization tried to erase from memory. But memory, unlike the places themselves, cannot be destroyed. It can only be suppressed. And suppression, as we have seen, is never permanent. The forbidden places are calling. Listen carefully. They have never stopped speaking. We simply forgot how to hear. Until next time, remember, the map is incomplete. The story is unfinished. And somewhere, just beyond the edge of what we know, the next discovery waits.